There is a country at the bottom of the world where the land is so old it has forgotten how to be young. The rocks here are among the oldest on the surface of the earth. Some of them formed before complex life existed, before oceans had their current shapes, before the continents had finished their long, slow drift into the arrangement we were taught to recognize in school. The land is red in places and pale gold in others. In the deep desert, the silence is so complete that travelers have described it as a physical weight, something that presses against the ears and fills the chest. This is Australia. And if you stand in the right place on the right night, when the stars are thick enough to cast a faint shadow across the spinifex grass, you can understand, without being told, why the people who have lived here the longest do not think of their history as something that happened in the past. They think of it as something that is still happening, continuously, all at once. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have maintained an unbroken cultural tradition for somewhere between 65,000 and perhaps 80,000 years. That number requires a moment of stillness to absorb. When the first Aboriginal peoples arrived on this continent, anatomically modern humans had only recently emerged from Africa. The pyramids of Egypt would not be built for another 55,000 years. Rome had not been imagined. The Norse were tens of thousands of years away from carving their first longship. The entire span of written human history, every war and empire and invention and collapse that we have managed to record, fits inside a fraction of the time that people have been telling stories in Australia. And they have been telling one story, or a version of one story, for almost all of that time. A story about beings who came before, beings who were tall, beings whose bones, if the elders are right, were never entirely hidden. In 1947, in the red interior of a continent that had already been picked over by European collectors and fossil hunters for a century and a half, something was found. The details, depending on who you ask, are either maddeningly incomplete or deliberately obscured, but the pattern they suggest is not new. The Aboriginal peoples had been pointing toward it for thousands of years. They had a word for it. They had drawings of it. They had ceremonies built around it. And when the land finally gave up something physical, something that could be measured and weighed and compared to a known human skeleton, the official response was, almost universally, silence. This is not a story that fits neatly into a textbook. It lives in a different kind of archive. It lives in the painted walls of sandstone shelters in the Kimberley. It lives in the stories that grandmothers tell to children at the edge of firelight. It lives in the plaster casts made by amateur researchers who were laughed at by universities and continued anyway. And it lives, quietly and without fanfare, in the memories of people who know that the land does not forget even when humans are asked to. If you are comfortable, you can let your body settle now. Whatever you are resting on, let it hold you fully. The sound of this voice will carry you through the night. There is no urgency here. There is only the slow turning of a very old story, examined from 8 different directions, over the course of an evening that belongs entirely to you. If this kind of content reaches you in a place of genuine curiosity, there is a community of people who think the same way waiting for you. Subscribing means you will never miss a long night like this one. Liking the video tells the quiet algorithm that stories like this are worth keeping. And if you fall asleep before it ends, that is not a failure. That is exactly what this space is for. The story will be here when you wake up. Now, let us begin at the beginning, or rather, at one of the beginnings. Because in Australia, beginnings are plural, and they are not linear, and some of them are still happening. The first thing you need to understand about Aboriginal oral tradition is that it is not mythology in the way that Europeans typically use that word. The word mythology, as it is commonly used in Western academic culture, carries a gentle implication of fiction. It suggests a category of story that was believed literally by people who did not yet have the tools to understand the world scientifically, and which can now be appreciated for its metaphorical content without being taken as factual description. The Odyssey is mythology. The Iliad is mythology. Beautiful, complex, deeply human documents that encode genuine cultural knowledge, but that no serious scholar believes were literal accounts of divine intervention and monsters. Aboriginal oral tradition does not belong to that category. Over the last several decades, a growing body of scientific research has begun to confirm that specific Aboriginal stories contain accurate factual information about events that happened thousands of years ago. Not metaphorically accurate, literally accurate, precisely accurate, in ways that should not be possible if these stories were simply invented. One example is the story of Cuddy Springs in New South Wales. Aboriginal oral tradition in that region preserved accounts of enormous animals that once lived in the landscape, creatures that no living person had ever seen, described with specific physical details. When paleontologists excavated Cuddy Springs, they found exactly those animals, the megafauna that Aboriginal stories had been describing, consistently, for generations. The stories were right. Another example involves the flooding of Bass Strait, the body of water that now separates mainland Australia from Tasmania. Aboriginal tradition preserved oral accounts of a time when you could walk from the mainland to what is now Tasmania. When geologists calculated the timeline of post-glacial sea level rise, they confirmed that Bass Strait was indeed above water during the period when humans first reached Australia. The land bridge existed. The stories were right. The geoscientist Patrick Nunn and the linguist Nicholas Reid published research in 2016 examining more than 20 Aboriginal stories that appear to describe specific episodes of coastal flooding caused by sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. These events would have occurred between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago. The stories, passed down through an oral tradition that had no writing, no archives, no external mechanism for verification, were accurate to identifiable geographic locations. Coastlines described in the stories, coastlines that are now underwater, match the mapped seafloor topography precisely. When you understand that context, the stories about the tall ones require a different kind of attention. They are not a single unified tradition. Australia is a continent, not a village, and the hundreds of distinct language groups that constitute Aboriginal culture each have their own names, their own specific accounts, their own ceremonial relationships with the beings that the stories describe. But across the breadth of the continent, across cultures that had limited contact with each other and developed their traditions largely independently, there is a recurring figure, a being of unusual or enormous size, a being that predates, in some accounts, the current order of the world, a being whose relationship to ordinary human beings is complicated, sometimes protective, sometimes dangerous, always significant. In Queensland and the Northern Territory, the being is known by a variety of names that translate roughly as hairy man or big man. The Kuku-Yalanji people of far north Queensland describe a large, powerful, forest-dwelling entity that has been part of their oral tradition since before contact with European settlers. The descriptions are remarkably consistent across generations. The being is tall, significantly taller than an ordinary human. It moves through rainforest and scrubland. It is not a spirit in the way that European traditions typically conceive of spirits. It has a physical body. It leaves physical traces. In Western Australia, particularly in the Pilbara and Kimberley regions, different communities describe different versions of what may be the same or a related phenomenon. The Noongar people of the southwest have their own accounts. The Martu people of the Western Desert have theirs. Each tradition has its own specific character, its own relationship to the landscape, its own rules about who can discuss these beings and under what circumstances. Some of this knowledge is sacred and is not shared with outsiders. What reaches the public record is necessarily incomplete, always filtered through the layers of what elders have judged permissible to speak about openly. What is permissible to speak about openly is already extraordinary. The linguist R.H. Matthews, who conducted fieldwork in southeastern Australia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, documented accounts from multiple Aboriginal informants describing large beings that had lived in the mountains and dense forest of the Great Dividing Range. His informants were specific about physical characteristics. They described creatures that walked upright, that were covered in hair, that were significantly larger than any human being, and that had been seen, directly, within living memory of the people he was interviewing. These were not ancestral stories from a distant mythological past. They were accounts of direct encounters with physical beings. The folklorist Charles Mountford, who conducted extensive research into Aboriginal culture and cosmology throughout the mid-20th century, recorded similar accounts from communities in South Australia and the Northern Territory. Mountford was a sympathetic and careful documentarian who took Aboriginal knowledge seriously, and his published work contains numerous references to beings described as physically large and powerful, associated with specific sacred sites, and understood by Aboriginal peoples as real historical entities rather than symbolic figures. The difficulty, from a research perspective, is that the sacred dimension of this knowledge creates significant barriers to systematic documentation. The most detailed and specific accounts are often exactly the ones that cannot be shared publicly. What survives in the academic record is a residue, the portion of the tradition that was already in the public domain or that elders judged appropriate to disclose to outside researchers. The full tradition, whatever it contains, remains largely internal, but even the residue is enough to establish a pattern. Across the continent, across language groups with minimal historical contact, Across different climatic zones and ecological regions, Aboriginal oral tradition consistently describes a class of being that is physically larger than ordinary humans, that is associated with the land in a deep and ancient way, and that existed in the world before the current arrangement of things. The dreaming, which is the English approximation of a concept that resists direct translation, is not a time in the past. It is more accurately described as a level of reality that underlies and generates the visible world, a dimension of existence in which the foundational patterns of life are continuously active. The beings of the dreaming are not dead. They are not sleeping in a metaphorical sense. They are present in the land in a mode of existence that ordinary waking perception does not access. When Aboriginal elders say that the tall ones are still here, they are not speaking poetically. They are describing, in their cosmological framework, a precise ontological claim. The beings are real. The bones are evidence. And the bones were found. The year 1947 is an interesting moment in Australian history to pause on. The Second World War had ended 2 years before. Australia was in the early stages of the post-war transformation that would reshape the country economically and socially over the following decades. The Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme was being planned. Large-scale European immigration was about to begin. The country was, in many ways, looking forward rather than backward, invested in modernity, development, the future. Archaeological and anthropological work in the interior was continuing, but without the systematic institutional support that would characterize research later in the century. The desert regions were vast and largely unmapped in any detailed sense. Access to remote areas required significant logistical effort: fuel, water, navigation, the heat, the distances. Many parts of the interior had been seen by very few Europeans, and some areas had been visited only by the Aboriginal peoples who had always lived there. It is in this context that the reports begin. The specific account that has attracted the most persistent attention involves the discovery of skeletal remains in a remote area of the Northern Territory, or, in some versions of the story, the far interior of South Australia. The accounts are not consistent in their geography, which is itself a detail worth examining. Either the story has been garbled through decades of retelling, or it describes multiple separate discoveries that have been conflated into a single narrative, or the specific location was never made part of the public record in the first place. Each of those possibilities tells you something different about the status of the information. What the accounts agree on is more significant than what they disagree about. Skeletal remains were found. They were human in form. They were unusual in size. The individuals to whom the bones belonged would, in life, have stood significantly taller than an ordinary human being, with some accounts suggesting heights of 7 or 8 feet, and more extraordinary claims suggesting even taller. The bones were examined, at least briefly, by someone with some authority to assess them, and then, in the version of the story that has been most widely repeated, they disappeared. The disappearance is the part that generates the most heat in discussions of this topic. Skeptics point out, correctly, that unusual or large skeletal remains have numerous mundane explanations. Gigantism is a medical condition that has affected humans throughout history. Measurement errors occur. Fossilization can alter the apparent size of bones in ways that mislead initial assessment. The Australian interior is geologically complex, and bones can be found in unusual orientations that complicate estimates of living height. All of these explanations are valid. None of them, taken individually or together, definitively accounts for all of the documented cases. But the disappearance argument cuts both ways. If the finds were simply the result of misidentification or measurement error, there would be no particular reason for them to disappear from the institutional record. Misidentified specimens get corrected and recatalogued. They become educational notes about how easy it is to make mistakes in field conditions. They do not typically become inaccessible. The pattern of inaccessibility is what gives researchers pause. There is a consistent structure to accounts of anomalous skeletal finds in Australia, and that structure involves initial discovery, initial examination, initial recording by someone in the field, followed by transfer to a museum or university collection, followed by the specimen becoming impossible to locate, not destroyed, not discarded, simply no longer findable. The catalogue entry may exist, the accession record may reference it, but the physical specimen, when requested, cannot be produced. This pattern is documented in enough separate cases that attributing it entirely to the ordinary chaos of institutional record-keeping becomes a less satisfying explanation with each additional instance. Museums do lose things. Collections do get mislabeled or stored incorrectly. Institutions from the 19th and early 20th century were not operating with the rigorous provenance standards of modern archaeology. Genuine accidents of archiving account for a real proportion of missing specimens across every area of natural history. The question is whether they account for this particular pattern in this particular area with this particular type of find. The researcher Rex Gilroy, about whom considerably more will be said in a later section of this account, spent decades collecting newspaper reports, field notes, and personal testimonies related to anomalous skeletal finds in Australia. His bibliography on this subject runs to hundreds of documented cases. The majority are from the 19th century, when newspapers routinely published accounts of unusual discoveries without the institutional gatekeeping that governs scientific publication. Miners, farmers, survey parties, construction workers, people who were moving earth in large quantities, who had no particular agenda about what they found, who simply recorded what they saw in the local paper. The accounts are remarkably consistent in their description. Large bones, human in form but unusual in scale, associated in many cases with artifacts that do not match the known material culture of either the Aboriginal peoples of the region or the European settlers. Stone tools of unusual size, appropriate for the scale of the hands that would have used them. Earthworks that no known group would have had the physical leverage to create without machinery. And in 1947 specifically, there is a concentration of reported activity. Several separate sources, unconnected to each other in the historical record, describe findings in the interior in that year. Whether these represent separate events or a single event described from different angles is not possible to determine with the surviving documentation. What is possible to determine is that the mid-20th century was a period of significant aerial surveying activity in the Australian interior, which was opening previously inaccessible areas to examination for the first time. Things were being seen from the air, and then followed up on the ground, that would not have been accessible to earlier researchers. The specifics of what was found, who examined it, and what became of it remain in the liminal space that this kind of history often occupies. Not confirmed, not refuted, documented enough to exist as a persistent question, not documented thoroughly enough to be answered through the existing archive alone. What the Aboriginal elders say about 1947 is harder to access than the newspaper record. The oral tradition about the tall ones was not something that required an external event to validate. The stories were already there. The bones, if the accounts are accurate, were confirmation of something already known. And the response of the community when those bones were found and then disappeared was not surprise. It was, by some accounts, a kind of grim familiarity. The knowing things had been taken before. They would be taken again. The stories were not dependent on the bones. The stories were older than any bones that could be found. There is a place in the Kimberley region of Western Australia where the rock walls of overhanging shelters are covered in paintings of extraordinary age and extraordinary strangeness. These are not the bold red ochre handprints that have become the visual shorthand for Aboriginal rock art in popular culture. They are something older and, in some important ways, more unsettling. They are the Gwion figures. In some academic literature, they are referred to by the name given to them by the first European to publish an account of them, a pastoralist and explorer named Joseph Bradshaw, who encountered them in 1891 and was so struck by their sophistication that he refused to believe they had been painted by Aboriginal peoples. He was wrong about that, but his instinct that something unusual was being depicted was not entirely unfounded. The figures are elongated, extraordinarily elongated. They depict what appear to be human beings, but human beings with proportions that do not match any average population of Homo sapiens. They are tall, the legs are long, the torsos are lean and attenuated. They are shown in many panels performing complex activities. They carry objects. They engage in what appear to be ceremonial or ritualistic behaviors. Some of them wear elaborate headdresses. Some of them have body adornments that researchers have compared to elements of ceremonial dress from multiple different ancient cultures, a comparison that is interesting but difficult to interpret precisely. The age of the Gwion paintings is debated, but current estimates based on the calcite accretion over the pigment, the weathering patterns, and the extinct pollen found in the paint layers suggest they are extraordinarily old. Some estimates place the oldest layers at between 17,000 and 50,000 years. The older end of that range would put the paintings at a period before the last glacial maximum, before the flooding of the continental shelf, before the landscape of the Kimberley looked anything like it does today. What makes the Gwion figures significant in the context of the tall ones is the tradition that surrounds them within certain Aboriginal communities. The Ngarrindjin people, the Warora people, and the Wunambal people, who are the traditional custodians of the country in which these paintings are found, have their own understanding of who created them. Their oral tradition does not attribute the Gwion figures to human artists in the ordinary sense. The tradition, as it has been shared with outside researchers, describes the figures as records of a different kind of being, not human ancestors in the biological sense, beings who were present in the early world before the current order was established, and whose presence is encoded in the rock as a form of permanent memory. The Wandjina community, which includes members of the three language groups associated with this part of the Kimberley, have been careful about what they share with the broader public regarding the Gwion and the related tradition of the Wandjina figures. What they have shared is enough to establish that these are not simply decorative paintings. They are documents. They record the presence of specific beings in specific places during specific periods of the deep past. The figures are not symbolic, they are representational, they show what was seen. If they show what was seen, then what was seen were beings with human-like anatomy but significantly different proportions. Taller, more attenuated in their physical form, wearing or carrying things that required a level of material sophistication that does not match the archaeological record of the region in the conventional understanding. The art historian George Chalupka, who spent decades studying rock art across northern Australia, noted in his published research that certain sites in the Arnhem Land region contained depictions of what he called dynamic figures, human-like forms shown in motion, with anatomical proportions that consistently showed greater height and more elongated limbs than the artists would have used to depict contemporary human beings. Chalupka was cautious about interpretation, as serious researchers tend to be. But he noted that the difference in proportion was systematic rather than incidental. It was not artistic convention in the way that Egyptian art elongated figures for symbolic reasons. It appeared to be an attempt at accurate representation of something that genuinely looked different. The Quincan figures of Cape York in far north Queensland represent another category of rock art that has been examined in this context. The Quincans come in two varieties according to the Kuku-Yalanji people. There are the Tamara, who are associated with goodness and protection, and the Imjim, who are associated with danger and predation. Both types are depicted as tall, spindly, elongated figures with unusually long limbs. The Imjim are shown as particularly threatening, associated with darkness and the deep forest, capable of extreme stretching of their limbs in ways that ordinary human anatomy does not permit. The anthropologist Ursula McConnell, who worked with Kuku-Yalanji communities in the 1930s, recorded detailed oral accounts of encounters with Quincan beings that were unambiguously understood by her informants as physical encounters with physical entities, not dreams, not visions, not metaphorical experiences. People had seen these beings. People in their living memory had been attacked by them. The beings had left physical traces. They were real. None of this constitutes scientific proof of anything in the narrow sense of that phrase. Rock art is not biology. Oral tradition, however ancient and however accurate in other domains, is not forensic evidence. The existence of consistent cross-cultural accounts of large humanoid beings does not prove the existence of large humanoid beings. It proves that the accounts exist, which is itself significant, but it is not the same thing. What it does do is establish the context in which the 1947 finds should be understood. These were not isolated discoveries in a vacuum of prior knowledge. They were, if the Aboriginal oral tradition is taken seriously as a form of historical documentation, confirmations of something that had been consistently recorded for longer than any other living tradition on Earth. The bones did not create the story. The story already existed. The bones, briefly, gave it a physical dimension that the dominant culture briefly acknowledged and then, apparently, declined to pursue. The rock art remains. The elongated figures with their inexplicable proportions and their complex material culture are still on the walls of the Kimberley shelters. They are still being studied by researchers who bring better imaging technology and more sensitive dating methods than were available to Bradshaw in 1891. And the Ngarrindjin and the Warora and the Wunambal still know what the figures represent. They have always known. There is a man who spent 50 years doing something that no institution would fund and no university would credential, and whose body of work is, depending on your perspective, either the most important archive of anomalous Australian natural history in existence or an elaborate monument to motivated reasoning. His name is Rex Gilroy. and the question of how to evaluate him is genuinely interesting. Rex Gilroy was born in New South Wales in 1944 and developed an early and consuming interest in the natural history of Australia, particularly in the areas that official science had not yet fully mapped. He was not, by training, a scientist. He never held an academic position. He worked for decades as a naturalist and researcher in an unofficial capacity, conducting fieldwork in the Blue Mountains, the Hawkesbury River Valley, and other regions of New South Wales where Aboriginal oral tradition described the presence of large, unknown hominids. He cast plaster molds of footprints. He photographed rock formations that he interpreted as evidence of large-bodied primates. He collected newspaper archives, personal testimonies, and historical records. He published his findings in a series of books and articles that were largely ignored by mainstream archaeology and enthusiastically read by the alternative history community. The footprint casts are the most physically compelling element of his work. The casts he made in the Hawkesbury River Valley and in the Blue Mountains region show prints that are human in basic morphology, showing the five-toed forward-facing plantar surface of a bipedal walker, but that are substantially larger than any ordinary human footprint. Some of the casts show prints in the range of 50 to 60 centimeters in length. A human footprint at that scale would correspond to an individual of extraordinary stature, well beyond the known range of human height variation. The obvious objection is that footprint casts can be fabricated or misinterpreted. This is true. It is also true that the geological context of the prints matters enormously, and that Gilroy's documentation of the geological context was not always as rigorous as academic standards would require. He was working alone, without institutional support, under conditions that did not permit the kind of controlled documentation that would make his evidence compelling to professional researchers. This is a genuine limitation of his work, but the distribution of the prints and their consistency across dozens of separate sites is harder to dismiss. A fabricator working alone would have to be extraordinarily dedicated to plant evidence across such a large geographic area over such an extended period. The sites where Gilroy documented prints span the full extent of the Greater Blue Mountains region and extend into the Hunter Valley, the Shoalhaven River country, and areas of the southern tablelands. This is a territory of several hundred square kilometers. The prints, in the photographic and cast record he preserved, are morphologically consistent across all of these sites. They look like prints made by the same type of foot, scaled up. The Aboriginal communities in these regions corroborated, in general terms, if not in specific collaboration with Gilroy's research, the existence of a large unknown entity in their tradition. The Darug people, the traditional custodians of much of the Hawkesbury River country, have their own name for the being. The Gundungurra people, whose country extends across the Blue Mountains, have theirs. The descriptions, filtered through the incomplete and often disrespectful documentation practices of 19th century ethnographers, are consistent with what Gilroy's physical evidence suggests. Something large, something upright, something that moved through these landscapes and left traces that the local communities had been recording in their oral tradition long before Gilroy arrived with his plaster. Gilroy also maintained a significant archive of newspaper reports from the colonial period. The 19th century was a time of extensive land clearing, mining, and construction activity across New South Wales, and all of that ground disturbance was turning up bones. The bones of giant marsupials mostly, the megafauna that had once dominated the continent, but also, according to a recurring thread in the newspaper record, bones that were human in morphology but unusual in scale. An 1880 report from the Bathurst Free Press describes workmen on a road construction project near Orange who uncovered skeletal remains of a human-like individual whose femur alone measured over 2 feet in length. A femur of that length would correspond to a living height of well over 7 feet by standard forensic estimation formulae. The report describes the bones as being brought to the attention of a local doctor, who confirmed the human morphology and the unusual scale, and then describes no further follow-up. The bones are not in any museum collection in New South Wales that Gilroy was able to locate. A similar report from the Maitland Mercury in 1875 describes a partial skeleton found during coal mining operations in the Hunter Valley. The account is brief, the kind of passing note that the newspaper of the time would include as a curiosity, not as a major story. But it notes the size of the bones, describes them as belonging to a man of unusual stature, and mentions that they were taken to Newcastle for examination. There is no further record. These individual reports, taken singly, are not compelling. Newspapers made errors, reporters exaggerated. Details were lost in transmission. But the pattern, across hundreds of separate accounts spanning the full century of intensive European land development in Australia, is not easy to dismiss as random noise. The accounts cluster in certain regions: the Blue Mountains and their flanks, the Hunter Valley, the western slopes of the Great Dividing Range, the Gulf Country, the Pilbara. These clustering patterns correspond closely with the distribution of Aboriginal oral tradition about the tall ones. The stories and the bones occupy the same geography. Gilroy died without receiving institutional recognition for his work. His collections, accumulated over 50 years of solo fieldwork, remain privately held and have not been systematically assessed by any mainstream research institution. His plaster casts, his photographs, his newspaper archive, his correspondence with Aboriginal informants who shared details they did not share publicly, all of it sits in storage in New South Wales, waiting for a researcher with enough independence of mind to treat it as data rather than as evidence of someone's eccentricity. That researcher has not yet arrived, or if they have arrived, they have not yet published. The archive is there, the question it poses is there. And the bones that were reported, found, and lost, they are somewhere too, in all probability. The land does not destroy things, it just holds them, quietly, until someone asks the right question in the right way. If you drive south from Broken Hill through the western edge of New South Wales, eventually you reach the Murray-Darling Basin and the complex of ancient lake systems that were once significantly larger than they are today. Before you reach the river itself, if you know where to turn off the highway, and you have the right permissions and the right vehicle and enough water for the conditions, you can reach the area around Lake Mungo, in what is now the Willandra Lakes World Heritage Area. The lake is dry. It has been dry for approximately 15,000 years. What remains is a series of extraordinary geological formations, pale crescent lunettes of wind-blown sand and clay that curve around the margins of where the water used to be, and within which the bones of the people who once lived on these shores have been emerging since the late 1960s. In 1969, a geologist named Jim Bowler was conducting survey work in the Willandra Lakes area when he noticed bones eroding out of a lunette. He notified the Australian National University, where a team led by the physical anthropologist Alan Thorne came to assess the find. What they found was the cremated remains of a young woman. She had been deliberately cremated, and the burned bones had been carefully gathered and placed in a small depression in the ground. She was buried with intention, with ceremony, with whatever understanding of death and what lies beyond it motivated her community to treat her remains in this specific way. The discovery was dated at roughly 26,000 years old at first, and subsequent dating has refined the estimate to approximately 42,000 years, making her the oldest cremation in the world. She's known as Mungo Lady, and in 1974, a few hundred meters from her resting place, Bowler found more bones. These were the bones of a man, buried on his side with his hands clasped together, his body dusted with red ochre. Mungo Man. He was dated at 40,000 years. He too was buried with ceremony. The red ochre used in the burial came from a source over 200 kilometers away. His community had carried it that distance, or traded for it over that distance, to use it in the burial of one of their people. These two individuals, the oldest human remains found in Australia, the oldest cremation in the world, the oldest evidence of long-distance trade in the archaeological record, were understood by the Pakenchi, the Mudi Mudi, and the Nyampa peoples, whose traditional country includes Mungo, as their ancestors. They were not scientifically interesting specimens to these communities. They were family. When the Australian federal government finally returned the Mungo remains to the traditional custodians in 2017, the return was treated as a homecoming, appropriate in every cultural and ethical sense, delayed by nearly half a century of institutional possession. The significance of Mungo in the context of the tall ones is not direct. Mungo Man was not exceptionally tall. Mungo Lady was not exceptionally tall. They were the physical dimensions of the people of their time, which was its own remarkable thing. But the existence of the Mungo burials, the fact that people were living at the edge of this now dry lake 40,000 years ago, with sufficiently developed ceremonial culture to conduct formal burials, to use ochre, to carry goods across hundreds of kilometers of desert, to practice cremation as a ritual technology, establishes the depth of human occupation of Australia in a way that reframes everything else. If human beings with full ceremonial culture, full symbolic capacity, full social complexity, were living at Mungo 40,000 years ago, then the oral traditions of their descendants cannot be casually dismissed as recent inventions. They are the output of a tradition that stretches back into the deep past in an unbroken line. when those traditions describe beings that were present in the early world, beings that were larger than contemporary humans, beings whose physical remains can still be found in the landscape if you know where to look. That description has the same claim on serious attention as the description of the animals at Cuddy Springs, or the description of the land bridge to Tasmania, or the description of the coastlines that are now under the sea. The Mungo discoveries changed the scientific understanding of when Australia was first occupied. Before Mungo, the prevailing estimate was around 30,000 years. Mungo doubled that estimate and more. And with each revision of the timeline, the antiquity of the oral tradition grows correspondingly. Each additional 1,000 years of confirmed occupation is an additional 1,000 years of stories, an additional 1,000 years of careful transmission, an additional 1,000 years during which the people at the fire knew what they had seen in the landscape and made sure the next generation knew it too. Alan Thorne, the physical anthropologist who led the Mungo excavation, spent the subsequent decades of his career arguing a position that placed him in significant professional conflict with the dominant model of human evolution. He was a proponent of what became known as the multi-regional hypothesis, the idea that modern humans did not originate solely in Africa and then spread to replace all existing human populations, but rather evolved simultaneously in multiple regions from earlier human populations through a complex process of migration and interbreeding. The competing model, now generally supported by genetic evidence, is the out-of-Africa hypothesis. The significance of this debate for Australian prehistory is that if modern Australians are partly descended from earlier human populations that were already present in the region before the arrival of anatomically modern humans from Africa, then the genetic diversity and physical range of prehistoric Australians may have been significantly greater than the modern population suggests. Earlier archaic populations that were already present in the region would have had different physical characteristics, including potentially greater height. The admixture of these earlier populations with incoming modern humans would create a gene pool with unusual physical variability, and the memory of the earlier population, the taller, different-looking beings who were there before the current people arrived, could survive in oral tradition long after the biological population itself was absorbed or displaced. This is not a mainstream interpretation. It remains speculative. The genetic evidence is complicated, and the ancient DNA work done on Aboriginal remains, where it has been possible given the sensitivity of such research and the requirements of community consent, suggests a more complex picture than either the strict out-of-Africa model or the strict multi-regional model predicts. But the possibility that the tall ones of Aboriginal oral tradition represent a cultural memory of a genuinely different earlier human population, one with different physical characteristics, including greater stature, is not scientifically absurd. It is a hypothesis that can be framed in terms of the current understanding of human evolutionary history, and that is consistent with the genetic evidence as far as that evidence currently extends. The bones at Mungo are now home. They rest in the country they came from, in the care of the communities that claim them as ancestors. But the questions they raise about the depth and complexity of human presence in Australia remain open, and the traditions of those communities, the stories about who else was here and when and what they looked like, remain one of the most significant untapped archives in the history of human science. The Wandjina are among the most distinctive figures in the entire record of human visual art. They appear on the walls of rock shelters across the Kimberley region of Western Australia, painted in red, black, white and yellow ochre, sometimes on surfaces that show dozens or hundreds of years of repainting and renovation by the communities who have always considered these figures to be living presences rather than historical records. The paintings are maintained. When the pigment fades, elders repaint it. When a new painting is added to a site, it follows the established conventions of the tradition absolutely. The Wandjina are not interpreted or reinterpreted by each new generation. They are remembered, preserved, kept exactly as they have always been. The figures themselves are immediately arresting. They have large round heads with enormous wide-set eyes. They have no mouths. Their bodies, when shown, are rounded and full, draped in something that has been variously described as a halo, a headdress, or a kind of radiating energy field. Some researchers have noted that the Wandjina figures bear a structural resemblance to the artistic depiction of alien beings in modern popular culture, and this has led to their enthusiastic adoption by the ancient astronaut subculture, which interprets them as evidence of extraterrestrial contact in the deep past. This interpretation is not endorsed by the Aboriginal communities who created and maintain the tradition, and it is probably worth spending a moment on why the resistance to that interpretation matters. The ancient astronaut reading of the Wandjina takes a being from Aboriginal cosmology, strips away its cultural context, its ecological relationships, its ceremonial significance, its connection to rain and to the renewal of the land, and replaces all of that with a Western science fiction framework. It is, in essence, another form of the colonial erasure that has already done enormous damage to Aboriginal cultural knowledge. The Wandjina do not need to be alien visitors to be significant. Their significance within the tradition that created them is already profound. Within that tradition, the Wandjina are the creative beings who shaped the country during the dreaming. They walked the landscape, their movements creating the rivers, the hills, the rock formations. When their creative work was complete, they entered the rock and remained there, continuing to be present in the country in a way that ordinary living beings are not. They are associated specifically with rain and with the monsoon cycle that the Kimberley depends on. The communities who maintain the paintings understand the maintenance work as part of their relationship with the Wandjina, as part of the reciprocal obligation that keeps the country healthy and the rains coming. What is significant in the context of the present account is not the ancient astronaut interpretation, but rather the specific physical characteristics attributed to the Wandjina within the tradition itself. They are described, in the oral tradition that accompanies the visual record, as beings of considerable size. The figures in the paintings are often shown at a scale that, if you were to apply it to a physical body, would produce an individual of 7 or 8 feet in height. Some of the painted figures are depicted at this scale relative to other figures in the same scene. The relative scaling is consistent across many different sites. The Mwandjam elder David Mwaljali, who died in 1997 and who was one of the most important custodians of Kimberley cultural knowledge to have worked collaboratively with outside researchers, described the Wandjina in terms that were carefully precise about their physical nature. He used the language of presence rather than the language of metaphor. The Wandjina were real. They had moved through the physical landscape. Their bodies had real dimensions. The painting showed what those dimensions were. The fact that they now existed primarily in a non-physical mode of being, imprinted in the rock, present in the country in the deep structural way that the dreaming is present everywhere, did not make them less real. It made them more real. Physical reality was only one layer of what real meant. The absence of mouths on the Wandjina figures is one of their most striking characteristics and one of the most discussed. The oral tradition offers an explanation. The Wandjina were so powerful, their voices so overwhelming in their capacity to transform the world, that they existed without mouths to contain and limit that power. When they spoke during the dreaming, the landscape changed. Mountains moved, rivers changed course. Their speech was not communication in the ordinary sense. It was creation. The absence of the mouth in the paintings is not a stylistic choice or a cultural convention. It is accurate representation of a genuine characteristic of the beings depicted. There is something in this account that rhymes, quietly, with stories from other traditions across the world, the being whose voice shapes reality rather than merely describing it. The word that is also a deed, the logos of the Greeks, the creative speech of the Abrahamic God, the Vedic concept of Shabda. These are not the same thing, but they are cognate in some way that transcends the cultural boundaries that would seem to separate them. The Wandjina with its missing mouth is an image of power beyond ordinary human comprehension, preserved in ochre on sandstone, maintained by communities who have never stopped understanding what it represents. Researchers from the University of Western Australia, working with Mwandjam community members in the 1990s and 2000s, conducted detailed photographic surveys of Wandjina sites across the Kimberley. The surveys documented hundreds of individual painted figures, many of them superimposed over earlier figures in a layering that represents thousands of years of continuous repainting. The underlying figures, visible in places where later paint has eroded, show the same basic morphological conventions as the contemporary figures: the large round head, the enormous eyes, the absence of the mouth, the radiating field around the head. These conventions have not changed across the full depth of the archaeological record at these sites. That continuity is itself a form of testimony. Whatever the Wandjina are or were or are understood to be, they have been depicted in the same specific way for longer than any other continuous artistic tradition in the world. The people who made the earliest paintings at these sites looked at something or understood something through their tradition that required exactly these visual conventions to represent accurately. And the people who repainted them over subsequent thousands of years agreed unanimously that the original representation was correct and should be preserved exactly. The bones found in 1947, whatever their precise location, and whatever became of them, are a small and fragile piece of physical evidence in comparison to this. The Wandjina tradition is not fragile. It is among the most durable things that human beings have ever made. It is painted on rock, it is encoded in ceremony. It is carried in the bodies of the elders who know the full version of the story, and it describes with the confident specificity of a tradition that does not hedge its claims. The presence of large, powerful, physically distinctive beings in this landscape during a period that predates any written history. In the state of Queensland, in the far north, where the rainforest meets the reef, and the heat is a physical presence that takes some time to learn to move through comfortably. There are sandstone escarpments that hold the oldest continuous gallery of rock art in the world. The Uluru Basin in the Cape York Peninsula contains several thousand individual rock art sites, accumulated over a period that researchers estimated over 60,000 years. The traditions associated with these sites belong to the Kuku-Yalanji people and their neighbors, and they remain, in significant respects, living traditions, not historical records, not museum pieces, ongoing relationships between human communities and the landscape they occupy. Among the most fascinating elements of the Uluru Basin rock art are the sorcerer figures, tall, dynamic, elongated human forms, shown in postures of great physical power and energy, associated by the Kuku-Yalanji tradition with ceremonial and supernatural authority. These are not the Quincan figures, which are in a separate category. They are human or near human, but their proportions are consistently exaggerated toward height and thinness, and their presence in the landscape is understood as charged, not to be approached without appropriate preparation. The Uluru area was the focus of a significant archaeological project in the 1970s, led by the archaeologist Percy Trezise, who worked in close collaboration with Kuku-Yalanji elder Dick Ruffsey. Their partnership produced some of the most important documentation of Cape York rock art ever achieved, and it was notable for the degree to which it was genuinely collaborative, with Ruffsey providing the cultural interpretation and Trezise providing the technical recording skills. The books they produced together remain valuable resources for understanding the tradition from the inside rather than from the outside. Ruffsey's accounts of the beings depicted in the Uluru rock art were explicit about their physical nature. He distinguished clearly between images of human ancestors, images of totemic animals, and images of beings from the deeper past who were not human in the contemporary sense. The figures that Trezise and Ruffsey documented in the deeper layers of the Quincan shelters, beneath the more recent paintings, are in this second category. They are depicted in ways that Ruffsey described as memory paintings, images that preserve the appearance of beings who had been present in the country in the time before the current world order was established. Memory paintings, in Ruffsey's articulation, are different from story paintings or totem paintings. They are an attempt to preserve exact visual information about something real that no longer appears in everyday life. They are the tradition's equivalent of a forensic sketch. You paint what you actually saw, or what your teacher told you was actually seen, with as much precision as the medium allows, because the purpose is not expression, but documentation. The memory must survive even when the memory holder does not. If the tall, elongated figures in the deeper layers of the Uluru sites are memory paintings in this sense, then what they document is the appearance of beings who were seen, directly or through a short chain of testimony, by people who lived in the Cape York Peninsula during the deep past. The figures are consistently tall, their limbs are consistently disproportionate to their torsos in the direction of elongation. Their hands and feet are often shown in unusual detail, as if the visual memory specifically encoded those features as significant identifiers. The question of what these beings are in the ontological sense, is not one that science is currently equipped to answer. The rock art records their appearance, the oral tradition records their behavior and their relationship to the human communities that coexisted with them. The physical evidence, bones found and lost, footprint casts collected by amateur researchers, the geological record of the interior, all of this points towards something that occupied this continent alongside the human populations that have always been here, something that was larger than those populations in physical scale, something whose existence was taken for granted in the oral tradition for as long as the oral tradition has existed. The European settlers who arrived in Australia from 1788 onward brought with them a set of assumptions about the natural world, about what was and was not possible, about which categories of being existed and which were merely superstition. Those assumptions were produced by a specific cultural and historical context that was not better than other cultural contexts in any fundamental epistemological sense. It was simply dominant. It had guns and ships and smallpox. Its categories prevailed because its carriers prevailed, not because the categories were more accurate descriptions of reality. When an Aboriginal elder in the 19th century described a large humanoid being seen near a certain waterhole, The European anthropologist who recorded the account typically classified it as legend, as myth, as evidence of a religious or spiritual belief system, and moved on to the next item of cultural documentation. The possibility that the elder was describing a direct encounter with a physical being, a being whose bones, as it happened, were occasionally turning up in mining works and road cuttings across the continent, was not a category that the European archive had room for. The evidence and the framework for understanding the evidence did not speak the same language. That translation failure has costs that compound over time. Each generation of researchers who dismisses the Aboriginal account as mythology is a generation that does not collect the physical evidence that would allow the account to be assessed against material reality. Each generation that files the anomalous bone, finds under unexplained, and moves on, is a generation that allows those specimens to disappear into the archive before their significance is understood. The cumulative effect of this systematic incuriosity is that we are now, decades or centuries later, trying to reconstruct a picture from fragments that should never have been allowed to become fragmentary. What the Kukuyalanji and the Ngarinyan and the Pakanchi and the Darug and the hundreds of other language groups across Australia have maintained, against enormous pressure and through extraordinary hardship, is the essential core of what was known before the European arrival. The tall ones are in there. They were always in there. The bones of 1947, wherever they ended up, confirmed what had always been said, and the search for the full story is not finished. It is, in certain quiet ways, only just beginning. There is a library that does not exist in any building. It is distributed across the landscape of Australia in Songlines, those extraordinary navigational and historical records that encode geographical, ecological, and historical information in the structure of ceremonial songs. A songline is a path across the landscape marked by significant sites, each of which corresponds to a verse or a set of verses in a song that describes the creation of that site during the dreaming. By singing the right verses in the right order, a person with the appropriate knowledge can navigate from one end of Australia to the other, using the landscape itself as a map that is also a library, that is also a history, that is also a ceremony. Bruce Chatwin's book The Songlines brought this concept to a wide non-Aboriginal readership in 1987, though Chatwin's treatment was, by the judgment of most Aboriginal scholars and several academic researchers, significantly romanticized and sometimes inaccurate. The concept itself, however, is real and has been extensively documented by more careful researchers. The anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose, who worked with Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory for several decades, described the Songline network as a system of knowledge management so sophisticated that it surpasses any information architecture that Western culture has produced in terms of its integration of geography, history, ecology, law, and spiritual knowledge into a single unified system. The significance of the songlines in the present context is that they represent in principle a record of everything that has been considered worth preserving about the landscape and its history. Not everything is publicly accessible within the songline tradition. As with all aspects of Aboriginal knowledge, there are levels of initiation required to access increasingly detailed and sensitive material, but the structure of the system implies that information about beings of unusual physical character, beings whose presence in the landscape was significant enough to be recorded, would have been preserved in this system if it was considered worth preserving. And the evidence from every other element of the tradition suggests that it was considered worth preserving. The language groups of Southeastern Australia, who were among the first to experience the full violence of European dispossession, lost large portions of their oral tradition during the 19th century. Disease, dispersal, the forced removal of children from their communities, the outlawing of language and ceremony, all of these produced catastrophic losses of knowledge from which many communities are still recovering. The Southeastern tradition is therefore the most damaged, the most fragmentary, the hardest to access in its original depth. It is precisely in the southeast that the physical evidence from the newspaper archives is most concentrated. The Hunter Valley, the Blue Mountains, the Murray-Darling system. These were the areas most intensively developed by European settlers, the areas where the most earth was turned, where the most mines were sunk, where the most roads were built. The concentration of reported finds in these areas is not coincidental. Development exposes what the earth holds. And the oral tradition, however damaged, still contains enough information to suggest that what the earth held in these areas was consistent with what the tradition described. The Wiradjuri people, whose country encompasses a substantial portion of central New South Wales, including much of the territory along the Macquarie and Lachlan rivers, have maintained a tradition of large, powerful beings associated with their country, despite the enormous pressures of dispossession. The term used in the Wiradjuri language, which has different names in different parts of their extensive country, refers to beings that are understood as physically real, not mythological, and as having been present in the landscape within historical time. The Wiradjuri historian Auntie Faye Mosley, in interviews conducted in the early 2000s, was specific about this point. These were not stories from before time. They were stories about things that had happened, things that could in principle be confirmed by physical evidence if the physical evidence had not been systematically lost. This is the thread that connects the oral tradition to the archival record to the physical finds. The tradition says the beings were here. The archival record from the 19th and early 20th centuries shows that bones of unusual scale were found. The institutional record shows that those bones were collected and then became inaccessible. And the 1947 account represents either the most recent documented instance of this pattern, a time when new aerial survey technology was opening new parts of the interior and allowing things to be found that had not been found before, or it represents the most recent instance of the pattern being noticed, which is a different thing. The women who are the primary custodians of certain categories of this knowledge in many Australian communities have rarely been consulted by the researchers who have pursued this question. The tradition is not exclusively male, and the portions of it that women hold contain different kinds of information than the portions held by men. Some of what the women know about the tall ones has never been shared with outside researchers, not because the communities are secretive for the sake of secrecy, but because no outside researcher has approached the right people with the right relationship and the right questions. This is the nature of the archive that matters most. It is human, it is alive, it is distributed across the country in the bodies and memories of people who are still living, people who are willing to share what they are permitted to share when they are approached with genuine respect and genuine curiosity. The bones of 1947 are important. The footprint casts in Rex Gilroy's storage are important. The rock art on the walls of the Kimberley shelters is important. But the most complete version of this story is in the tradition itself, in the knowledge that has been carefully tended through 60,000 years of Australian life, in the understanding that the country holds everything that has ever happened here, and that the people who know the country best have always known what it holds. There is a dimension to this story that moves beyond the question of whether large-boned individuals lived in prehistoric Australia and into something more difficult to name, something that sits at the intersection of history and cosmology, of physical evidence and inherited understanding, of what can be measured and what can only be carried. The Aboriginal concept of country, which is consistently capitalized in contemporary Australian academic and cultural writing to mark it as a proper noun, a specific kind of entity rather than a generic descriptor, is relevant here. Country is not simply a geographic area. It is not land in the sense that European legal systems use that term, as a resource to be owned and exploited. Country is a living system. It has memory, it has presence. It has relationships with the human communities that belong to it. Relationships that are reciprocal, that carry obligations, that are understood as the foundation of all other relationships. When Aboriginal elders say that the tall ones are part of country, they are making a claim about the ontological status of these beings that is more specific than it might first appear. They are saying that the beings exist in country in the way that everything exists in country, as a pattern in the living fabric of place, as a presence that the land holds and that the land can reveal under certain conditions. The bones found in 1947 were not created by the land, but they were held by the land, kept within it, and released when the land decided, in its own terms, to release them. The subsequent disappearance of those bones into an institutional archive, where they became inaccessible, was, from this perspective, not an ending. It was a temporary mislocation. The land still holds the full record. The bones are part of country, whether they are in a museum drawer or in the earth. This cosmological framing does not replace the physical and historical questions. It does not make the scientific investigation less important or less interesting, but it provides a context in which the investigation can be understood, not as an attempt to prove or disprove a mythology, but as an attempt to read a text that has always been there, in a language that has always been available to those who learned how to approach it correctly. The elders who have spoken most carefully about this material over the years have been consistent about one thing. The stories are not waiting for scientific confirmation. They are complete as they are. The scientific evidence, when it comes, will be welcome, will be important for the people in the dominant culture who need that kind of confirmation before they can hear what has already been said. But the Aboriginal communities that hold this tradition do not need the bones of 1947 to be verified in order to know what they know. They have always known. The bones and the rock art and the footprint casts and the newspaper archives and the aerial surveys that opened the interior in the mid-20th century. All of these are the physical dimension of a story whose primary existence is elsewhere, in the tradition, in the country, in the unbroken chain of transmission that has carried this knowledge from the first people who saw the tall ones moving through the early world all the way to the present moment. That chain of transmission is one of the most extraordinary achievements in the entire history of human culture. No other tradition has maintained continuous, unbroken transmission for anything approaching the time span of the Aboriginal tradition. The closest competitors, the Vedic tradition of India, the oldest elements of the Mesopotamian record, are separated from the Aboriginal tradition by tens of thousands of years of additional depth. The knowledge encoded in these traditions, including the knowledge about the tall ones, has survived ice ages, megafaunal extinctions, sea level changes of over 100 meters, and most recently, the most intense and violent campaign of cultural destruction that any tradition has faced since the systematic Roman destruction of indigenous European traditions in the first centuries of the Common Era. It survived all of that. The stories are still here. The country is still here. And somewhere in the red earth of the interior, and in the sandstone shelters of the Kimberley, and in the deep forest of the Great Dividing Range, the physical evidence is still here too, waiting for the combination of institutional openness, community trust, and scientific method that would finally allow the physical record and the oral record to speak to each other in the same room at the same time. That conversation has not yet fully happened, but it is closer than it has ever been. The return of the Mungo remains to their communities in 2017 was part of it. The growing body of research validating Aboriginal oral tradition as an accurate record of geological and ecological history is part of it. The new generation of Aboriginal scholars who are pursuing doctorates and publishing in peer-reviewed journals while remaining grounded in their own traditions is part of it. And the steady, quiet, persistent presence of the tradition itself, maintained by communities who never stopped knowing what they knew, is the foundation of all of it. The tall ones walked here, the land remembers, the stories endure, and the bones, wherever they are still waiting to come home. The night is moving toward its deepest hour now, the part of the night where the body is fully surrendered, and the mind floats free of its usual structures, where the stories that were told around fires for 60,000 years can travel without obstacle, through whatever distance lies between the voice and the ear. Australia is turning slowly in the dark. The red desert at its center is cold, the heat that bakes it in the daylight hours having long since radiated upward into the clear, enormous sky. The stars above the interior are extraordinary, so numerous and so bright in the absence of any light pollution that they seem almost too many, almost too close, a density of light that the eye tries and fails to fully resolve. The Aboriginal astronomers, whose tradition of sky knowledge extends back as far as any other element of the culture, have names for the dark spaces between the stars as well as for the stars themselves. The dark constellations, the shapes made by absence rather than presence. The emu in the sky made from the dark clouds of the Milky Way. The tradition holds that the sky is also country, that the patterns in it are also records, that the knowledge encoded in the stars is of the same kind as the knowledge encoded in the land. If you watch the sky from the center of Australia, you can see things that are invisible from almost anywhere else on Earth. The southern constellations, Scorpius hanging low over the red horizon, the Southern Cross pointing south, the Magellanic Clouds, the satellite galaxies of the Milky Way, visible to the naked eye only from the southern hemisphere and only in the absence of the light pollution that covers most of the world. The Aboriginal tradition has precise knowledge of all of these, and it has stories about them, stories that encode the same careful, long, patient observation of the sky that the stories about the land encode observation of the landscape. What the stories about the tall ones ultimately point toward, across all the different traditions and all the different names and all the different specifics of the individual accounts, is the idea that the world is older than our current knowledge allows, that the beings who have inhabited it are more various than our current taxonomy describes, and that the most complete record of that variety is held not in any institution or any archive, but in the living memory of people who have never stopped being responsible for it. The bones found in 1947 matter. The footprints in the Blue Mountains matter. The elongated figures in the Kimberley rock shelters matter. The newspaper reports from the colonial period matter. But they are footnotes, in a sense, to the main text, which is the tradition itself, still moving through the country, still carried in ceremony, still told at the edge of firelight, by people who know that what they are carrying is irreplaceable and who have paid an enormous price to keep carrying it. Sleep now, if you're ready. The country is quiet, the elders are at rest. And somewhere in the deep interior, in the red earth that holds everything that has ever happened here, the bones are still and waiting, and patient in the way that only very old things can be patient, knowing, perhaps, that the right question is still forming in the minds of people who have not yet thought to ask it, but who are, quietly and without knowing it, moving closer to the moment when they will. The story does not end. It continues in the dark, in the way that all the oldest stories continue, underground, beneath the noise of the surface world, in the slow, deep register of the land itself. And if you're very still and very quiet, and if the night around you is dark enough, you might feel the edges of it, the vast, unhurried presence of something that has been here far longer than any of us, and that will be here long after the last question about it has been asked and answered and forgotten and asked again. Rest now. The tall ones are in the country. The country holds them gently. And the tradition that has always known this is still, after everything, intact. There is a word that has passed into the broader Australian cultural vocabulary without losing its specific meaning to the communities who gave it. The word is Yowie. It appears in newspapers, in campfire conversations, in the occasional breathless television documentary filmed in the bush at night with night vision cameras and excited commentary. It has been attached to a chocolate confectionery product. It has been made into a mascot. And in the process of being made into a cultural commodity, it has been gradually separated from the Aboriginal tradition that is its only legitimate source, made into something entertainment-friendly and vaguely comic, something that can be put on a child's lunchbox without requiring anyone to take it seriously. The Aboriginal tradition from which the Yowie comes is not comic, it is not entertainment, it is not a mascot. The Southeastern Australian traditions that use the word, or the family of words that have been rendered in English as Yowie, describe a being of specific physical and behavioral character. It is large, significantly larger than an ordinary human being. It is covered in hair, it walks upright, it inhabits the dense forest and mountain country of the Great Dividing Range and its associated ranges. The Blue Mountains, the Snowy Mountains, the Border Ranges, the Bunya Mountains of Queensland, the ranges of northeastern New South Wales. The country it inhabits is not arbitrary. These are the areas of greatest topographic complexity, the areas with the deepest gullies, and the most impenetrable forest cover, the areas where large-scale land clearing has been most limited and where the ecology retains the most ancient structure. The accounts of Yowie encounters that have been documented over the past 150 years span an extraordinary social range. They include accounts from Aboriginal community members who experienced the encounters within a traditional cultural framework and who understood them as encounters with a specific known type of being. They include accounts from European settlers and farmers who had no prior knowledge of the Aboriginal tradition and who described what they saw in their own straightforward terms: a large, upright, hair-covered creature, unlike anything they had previously encountered. They include accounts from bushwalkers, from miners, from loggers, from people who were, in various capacities, in the deep bush, and who saw something they could not explain, and who reported it with the matter-of-fact directness of people who were not trying to tell an interesting story, but simply trying to describe something that had actually happened to them. The consistency across these accounts is what is most striking when you examine the full archive. The physical description varies in detail, but not in substance. The creature is always substantially larger than a human being, typically described as between 7 and 10 feet in height, with estimates varying depending on the distance of the sighting and the conditions. It is always described as bipedal, walking upright on two legs rather than moving on all fours in the manner of a known large primate. It is always described as heavily built, with physical presence and apparent mass that the witnesses find impressive or frightening. It is almost always described as moving with a degree of speed and agility that seems inconsistent with its size. The smell is also a consistent element. Multiple accounts describe a powerful, characteristic odor associated with Yowie presence. The odor is described variously as musky, as sulfurous, as overwhelmingly animal, as distinct from any domestic animal smell, and unlike anything the witness had previously encountered. This olfactory detail is particularly significant because it is the kind of specific involuntary sensory information that fabricated accounts tend not to include. Inventing an encounter story, you would describe what you saw. You would describe the size and the appearance and the movement. The smell is the kind of detail that comes from actual experience of a physical presence, from being close enough to something real to detect its biochemistry. The Bundjalung people, whose country covers much of northeastern New South Wales and southeastern Queensland, have a detailed and well-documented tradition relating to the being they call the Doolagol or the Gulaga, their language group's equivalent of what the broader Australian culture has rendered as the Yowie. The anthropologist Margaret Shaw, who conducted extensive fieldwork with Bundjalung communities in the 1960s and 1970s, documented multiple accounts that treated the Doolagol as a physically real, currently extant being, not an ancestral memory, not a metaphor, but something that people might encounter on a walk through the right kind of country. Her informants described precautions taken when entering certain areas of deep forest, behaviors that made sense only in the context of a real risk of encountering a real being. You do not take precautions against metaphors. The Gunai people of Gippsland in Victoria have their own tradition of large, forest-dwelling bipeds, known in some accounts as the Nagun, though the Nagun is also associated with specific rock formations and carries additional dimensions of significance beyond the simple physical description. The Nagun accounts collected by the folklorist W.A. Cawthorne in the mid-19th century describe encounters with beings that left large footprints in riverbank mud, that were heard moving through forest at night, and that were associated with specific sites that Aboriginal communities were careful about approaching. The Kulin Nations of Victoria, the confederation of language groups that occupied the country around what is now Melbourne, and the Central Victorian Highlands, had their own accounts that were recorded with varying degrees of accuracy by the settler ethnographers of the colonial period. These accounts were typically classified by the recorders as mythology or as accounts of spirits, following the default interpretive framework that understood all Aboriginal supernatural accounts as religious in the narrow Western sense, rather than as potentially empirical descriptions of real phenomena. This misclassification, applied uniformly across the colonial period, has made it very difficult to reconstruct the original intent of the accounts. Were the witnesses describing physical encounters with physical beings? Were they describing spiritual entities that were understood to have physical effects in the world? Were they describing both in a framework that does not maintain the Western distinction between physical and spiritual as separate categories? The original documentation does not allow this distinction to be made reliably, because the people who created the documentation were not asking those questions. What can be said is that the Yowie tradition, in all its geographic and linguistic variety across southeastern Australia, is consistent with a physical reality rather than a purely spiritual or metaphorical one. The physical details are too specific, the behavioral descriptions are too consistent, the geographic distribution is too closely tied to actual areas of dense, complex habitat to be simply a projection of cultural anxiety onto empty landscape. Something generated these accounts across hundreds of years of European settlement and tens of thousands of years before that. Something that was present in the landscape and that was encountered by people who described what they saw with appropriate directness. The 1947 reports of bone finds in the interior may or may not be directly connected to the Yowie tradition. The Yowie is associated primarily with forested mountain country rather than with the arid interior. But the broader pattern, large physically distinctive beings documented in oral tradition across the continent, physical evidence of unusual skeletal remains periodically coming to light and then disappearing into institutional obscurity, is consistent across both the forest and the desert traditions. The continent is large enough to hold more than one kind of large being, and the Aboriginal tradition has always been precise about the distinctions between different categories of being in different ecological zones. What the forest traditions describe and what the desert traditions describe may be different beings, or varieties of the same being, or beings that shared a common ancestor in the deep past of this landscape and diverged over the 50,000 years of continuous habitation. The tradition knows the difference, even if the outside observer does not yet have the tools to map those distinctions accurately. The Yowie, finally extracted from its chocolate wrapper and its television documentary context, and returned to its proper home in the Aboriginal tradition, is an extraordinarily significant figure. It is a being that the oldest continuous culture on Earth has consistently described as real, physical, and present in the landscape. It is a being that has been encountered repeatedly by people with no prior knowledge of the tradition. It is a being whose physical traces, footprints, smells, sounds, glimpsed forms in the forest edge, have been documented independently by people from completely different cultural backgrounds using completely different descriptive frameworks, and who have arrived at the same essential description. That convergence is not nothing. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of evidence pattern that a serious researcher should find interesting, regardless of what the institutional consensus says about the subject. The Colonial Archive of Australia is vast, disorganized, and underexplored. The newspapers of the 19th century covered an enormous geographic area, with minimal staff and correspondents spread across remote regions who filed their reports by mail or by telegraph, often weeks or months after the events they described. The result is a record that is rich in incidental detail and poor in systematic documentation, full of reports that were noted down once and never followed up, full of finds that were interesting enough to mention in print but not important enough, from the perspective of the colony's primary economic and political preoccupations, to investigate thoroughly. Within this archive, the pattern of anomalous skeletal finds is persistent and geographically widespread. The following is not an exhaustive account, but a representative selection of the kind of material that exists in public newspaper archives across the Australian states. The Sydney Morning Herald of September 1884 carried a brief item in its miscellany column reporting that workers excavating for a new building in the Parramatta area had uncovered a skeleton of unusual dimensions. The correspondent, identified only by initials, reported that the skull was larger than a normal human skull, that the leg bones were proportionally extended, and that the whole impression conveyed by the remains was of an individual substantially larger than ordinary experience. A doctor was summoned and confirmed the human character of the remains before sending them to a collection at the University of Sydney for examination. The University of Sydney's current archival records, as examined by several researchers over the past 3 decades, contain no reference to these remains. The Queenslander of August 1887 reported that a station hand on a property near Longreach had found what appeared to be a human jaw of unusual size eroding from a riverbank. The jaw was described as wider than both hands placed side by side, an informal measurement that corresponds to a jaw size significantly beyond the known human range. The station hand, identified by name, reported bringing the jaw to the nearest town, where it attracted considerable local interest before being taken by a visiting government geologist for forwarding to the Queensland Museum. The Queensland Museum's records of this period are incomplete due to several fires and floods in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but the staff member who examined the archive for this specific accession found no trace of it. The Advertiser of Adelaide, in November 1891, published a report from a correspondent in the Flinders Ranges describing the discovery of a human skeleton in a rock shelter that had been exposed during the expansion of a sheep station's fencing. The skeleton was described in unusual detail. The correspondent had clearly spent time examining it and was trying to be precise. The skull was compared to a large watermelon in size. The ribs were compared to the staves of a barrel. The leg bones were reported as coming to the correspondent's waist when he stood the femur upright on the ground, and the correspondent described himself as being of average height for a man of his time, approximately 5 feet 8 inches. A femur that reached the waist of a 5 foot 8 inch man would measure approximately 30 to 34 inches, corresponding to a living individual of 8 to 9 feet in stature. The bones were photographed, according to the correspondent, though no photograph has been located. They were subsequently removed by the station owner for preservation, but no further record exists. The Argus of Melbourne published in 1903 an extended report from a pastoral district in northwestern Victoria, describing a series of finds along the banks of a seasonal watercourse. The reporter had travelled to the district specifically to investigate reports of unusual skeletal remains that had been circulating among the local farming community. He interviewed 4 individuals who had independently seen or handled the remains and whose accounts were consistent with each other in the essential details. The remains were human in form. They were larger than any human being the witnesses had encountered. They were partially mineralized, suggesting considerable age. They were associated with stone tools of a type that the witnesses, none of whom were archaeologists, described as too large for ordinary use by ordinary-sized people. The reporter's conclusion was cautious but interested. He recommended that a qualified scientist examine the finds. The newspaper's subsequent issues contained no follow-up, whether a scientist was dispatched and filed a negative report, or no scientist was dispatched, or a scientist was dispatched and found something that was not subsequently published, cannot be determined from the archive. The pattern of these reports extends through the colonial period and into the early decades of the 20th century. It is not limited to any single colony or state. It is not limited to any single type of land use or development activity. It appears in mining reports and farming reports and construction reports and survey reports. It comes from people of different occupations, different educational backgrounds, different geographic locations. The consistent elements are the size of the remains, the human morphology, the absence of follow-up, and the inaccessibility of the physical specimens in the institutional record. What happened to all of these bones is not a question that has a simple answer. Some were undoubtedly lost in the ordinary chaos of colonial record keeping. Some were misidentified, the bones of very tall but otherwise ordinary human beings, or the bones of animals that an inexperienced observer could mistake for human remains. Some may have been reburied deliberately by Aboriginal community members who recognized the cultural significance of the finds and who retrieved them before they could be taken away. And some, if the pattern that researchers like Rex Gilroy have documented is to be taken seriously, were taken into institutional collections and have since become inaccessible in ways that do not match the ordinary patterns of archival loss. The Smithsonian Institution in the United States has been the focus of significant controversy over its management of anomalous skeletal remains from North America, where a parallel tradition of reports about large bone skeletal finds runs through the 19th century newspaper archive. The Native NAGPRA legislation of 1990, which required the repatriation of Native American remains held in U.S. federal institutions, created a process by which the extent of skeletal holdings could be partially examined, and in that process, certain anomalies in the catalogue records became visible to researchers who had been asking questions about unusual find reports. In Australia, the equivalent legislation, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act of 1984 and its subsequent amendments, created a similar framework for repatriation, and the repatriation processes of the past 3 decades have involved the examination of museum and university collections in ways that have sometimes surfaced unexpected materials. The Mungo repatriation, completed in 2017 after decades of advocacy by the 3 traditional custodian groups, was the highest profile of these cases. But the repatriation process, applied across the full breadth of Australian institutional holdings of Aboriginal remains, is still ongoing, and the full extent of what those holdings contain has not been publicly documented. This is not an allegation of conspiracy, it is an observation about process. Large institutions that have held human remains for over a century, often collected under conditions that would not be considered ethical by contemporary standards, and often catalogued by people who were working with the classificatory assumptions of their time, have complex and sometimes poorly documented holdings. The repatriation process, which requires these institutions to examine their holdings in detail in order to identify what they have and who it belongs to, creates opportunities for materials to be encountered that were not previously accessible to researchers. Whether those materials in the Australian context include skeletal remains of the kind described in the 19th century newspaper archive remains to be seen. The process is incomplete. The examination is ongoing. The communities that hold the living tradition of the Tall Ones are, in many cases, engaged with these institutions around the question of remains repatriation, and they bring to those negotiations a knowledge of what should be there that comes from sources entirely outside the institutional archive. The conversation between the living tradition and the institutional record is happening, slowly, with the difficulty that always attends genuine cross-cultural dialogue across enormous asymmetries of power. But it is happening, and when it produces results, when the bones are found in a drawer, and the tradition confirms what they are, and the science confirms their age, and the communities receive them home, that will be a moment that changes how this question is asked and answered by everyone who is still asking and answering it. There is a broader frame into which the Australian story fits, and that frame is worth pausing to describe, because it changes the scale of what we are looking at. The tradition of large beings in the deep past of the landscape is not unique to Australia. It is, in various forms, one of the most universal elements of the world's oral traditions. The giants of Norse mythology, the Nephilim of the Hebrew tradition, the Titans of Greek mythology, the giant beings described in the Vedic epics of India, the Quinametsin of Aztec tradition, the giant ancestors described in the traditions of the Pacific Islands, the Maori traditions of the Patupaerehe, and the earlier large people who preceded the Polynesian arrival in New Zealand. Across every inhabited continent, across traditions with no known historical contact with each other, there is a recurring account of beings significantly larger than contemporary humans who inhabited the world in the distant past. The skeptical interpretation of this pattern is that human beings universally produce stories about giants because giants are a psychologically compelling fantasy, because large size equates to power and authority in the human social imagination, because the concept of a bigger, stronger ancestral being explains the landscape features that early peoples observed without the benefit of geological science. A cliff cut by glaciation is explained as the work of a giant. A stone formation created by volcanic activity is explained as the footprint of a giant. The traditions are projections of human psychology onto a landscape whose actual history was not understood. This interpretation is not satisfying, as explanations go, for the same reason that the purely mythological interpretation of Aboriginal oral tradition is not satisfying. It accounts for the existence of giant traditions in general, but does not account for the specificity of the physical descriptions, the consistency of the anatomical details across traditions, or the accompanying physical evidence that occasionally surfaces to suggest that the accounts are not purely symbolic. The physical evidence in the global context follows the same pattern as the Australian evidence. Skeletal remains of unusual size are found. They are briefly examined, they are catalogued or reported in local newspapers, or collected by local authorities, and then they become inaccessible. This pattern has been documented in sufficient geographic spread across Europe, the Middle East, North America, and Australia to suggest that it is not the product of random archival chaos in any one place, but something more systematic. The Smithsonian has been the focus of the most sustained and most carefully documented research into the institutional management of unusual skeletal finds, and the case made by researchers including Richard Dewhurst, who examined US newspaper archives for giant skeleton reports in his 2013 work on the subject, parallels the Australian case almost exactly. Reports from the 19th century. Physical specimens entered into institutional collections. Physical specimens no longer locatable. The coincidence of this pattern across multiple continents and multiple institutional systems is at minimum a phenomenon that deserves serious investigation. In Australia, the additional dimension is the oral tradition, which has greater antiquity and greater demonstrated reliability than any tradition in the world. When the people with the oldest continuous knowledge system on Earth describe large beings as a historical reality, and when physical evidence consistent with their descriptions periodically surfaces and periodically disappears, the intersection of those two facts is not something that can be reasonably dismissed by reference to either psychologically motivated myth-making or archival accident. It is a pattern with a shape, and the shape points somewhere. The direction in which it points is not ultimately towards sensation or conspiracy, or the validation of any particular alternative history framework. It points toward a simple and significant revision of what we think we know about the deep past of human life on this continent, and by extension, on this planet. The revision is this: the humans who inhabited the world before writing, before agriculture, before the civilizational structures that have produced our current understanding of what counts as history, were more various than we currently acknowledge. The range of physical types, the range of cultural practices, the range of relationships between human populations and their environments was wider and more complex than the narrow surviving sample of contemporary humanity suggests. And the oral traditions that record what that range looked like, traditions like the Aboriginal traditions of Australia, are not footnotes to the story of human prehistory. They are the primary sources. They are the actual record. Everything else is reconstruction. Treating them with the seriousness they deserve is not a choice between science and story. It is a choice about which kind of evidence counts and who gets to decide. And on that question, the evidence is clear. The communities who have been responsible for this knowledge for 65,000 years have a better claim to be heard than any institution that has held their ancestors' bones in a drawer for 130 years and cannot account for where they are. The question of what happened in 1947 specifically is probably not resolvable through the archive as it currently exists. The documentation is too thin, too dispersed, too dependent on accounts that were never formally corroborated. What happened in 1947 is most likely this: in a period of expanded aerial survey activity in the interior, in a landscape that had been turned and examined by European enterprise for a century and a half without exhausting its capacity for significant finds, skeletal remains of unusual character were found in one or more locations, and were entered into a process of institutional examination from which they did not clearly emerge. This is a description of an outcome, not an explanation of the outcome. Why they did not clearly emerge from that process is the question that remains open. The people with the deepest investment in that question are not, in the end, the alternative history researchers or the academic archaeologists or the journalists who write about mysteries. They are the Aboriginal communities whose tradition has always included the tall ones, whose understanding of the landscape is comprehensive enough to know where to look for what the land holds, and whose relationship with country gives them a claim on what is found that no institution and no individual researcher can match. When those communities are the primary interlocutors in the investigation of these questions, when the research is designed in collaboration with them rather than conducted on their country over their objections, and when the institutional systems that currently hold contested materials are required to account fully and transparently for what they have, the answers that emerge may well surprise everyone. The tall ones walked here. The land holds their bones. And the oldest story in the world says that some knowledge is too important to lose and too patient to disappear. Let the night carry you now. There is nothing left to hold. The questions that have moved through these pages are genuine and good questions, the kind that deserve years of patient inquiry rather than the single evening of attention that a night like this one can give them. But the attention is not wasted. The mind that is exposed to a question, even in the half-conscious state of late-night listening, is a mind that has been prepared. Something has been planted. Whether it grows or not depends on what happens next, on whether the question is still there in the morning, on whether it attaches itself to the part of consciousness that pursues rather than the part that forgets. The Aboriginal tradition has been planting questions in the landscape of this continent for 65,000 years. The questions are in the paintings on the rock and the patterns in the songs and the specific care with which each generation has preserved exactly what was given to it. They are patient questions. They are not in a hurry. They have been waiting for the rest of the world to become quiet enough to hear them, and they are prepared to keep waiting for as long as that takes. In the meantime, the country is beautiful in the dark. The stars above the interior are extraordinary. The silence, for those who have learned to be comfortable in it, is one of the deepest available on this planet, and somewhere in the landscape, in the country that holds everything that has ever happened here, the bones of the tall ones are resting as they have always rested, as they will continue to rest, until the right hands and the right eyes and the right questions arrive together, in the same place at the same time, and the land, deciding it is ready, gives them up. Sleep well. The oldest story in the world is still being told, and it will be here in the morning. The red monolith rises from the desert floor with the authority of something that has been there longer than human memory. Uluru. Its mass is not its most significant characteristic, though the mass is extraordinary. A sandstone formation that extends 3 kilometers below the surface for every kilometer visible above it. The visible tip of an underground mountain that was folded into existence approximately 500 million years ago when the collision of tectonic plates compressed layers of sediment into vertical stone. Its most significant characteristic, from the perspective of the Anangu people, who are its traditional custodians, is what it contains, not minerals, not geological interest. What it contains is the record of the dreaming encoded in the specific configurations of its surface, its caves, its waterholes, its tracks and marks and overhangs. Every feature of Uluru, to the Anangu, is a record of specific events and specific beings from the foundational time of the world's making. The tradition of the Anangu distinguishes between the Chukopa, the lore and story of the dreaming that is the foundation of all life and relationship, and the historical time that has followed from it. The beings of the Chukopa are not simply metaphorical ancestors. They walked the land in a specific, physically real way. Their movements created the features of the landscape. Their conflicts and journeys and acts of creation are encoded in the stone and the earth and the water. To walk around Uluru, as tens of thousands of tourists do each year, is, from the Anangu perspective, to walk through a text that describes the actions of beings of enormous power and, in several traditions associated with the site, of enormous physical scale. The Kunia, the Woma python of the Chukopa, is the protagonist of one of the most significant stories associated with Uluru's southern face. The Kunia is depicted in oral tradition and in the markings on the rock itself as an entity of extraordinary size and power. The scale of the being, as described in the tradition, is not the scale of an ordinary python. It is the scale of something considerably larger than any contemporary organism. The cave on the southern face of Uluru, known as Mutijulu Waterhole, is the site of the climactic confrontation in the Kunia story. And the physical features of that cave, the striations in the rock, the specific configuration of overhangs and pools, are understood as the literal physical traces of that confrontation, left in the stone at the moment of maximum force. The Mala hair wallaby people, who feature in other traditions associated with Uluru, are depicted as small in comparison to the landscape, as ordinary human beings in the scale of ordinary life. But there are other beings in the Uluru tradition who are not described at ordinary human scale. The Liru, the poisonous snake people who are the antagonists in the Kunia story, are described as possessing a physical force that exceeds ordinary human capacity. The markings associated with them on the western face of Uluru are large, forceful, suggestive of an impact made by something moving with tremendous mass and momentum. This is not a territory where outside researchers can go very deep. The Anangu are careful custodians of their tradition and have been specific about which elements of the Chukopa are appropriate to share publicly and which are not. What they have shared publicly at the Uluru Karajuda Cultural Centre and in the interpretive materials available to visitors gives a clear sense of the structure of the tradition without opening its sacred core to examination. The public record is enough to establish that the Anangu tradition includes beings of extraordinary size and force, beings whose physical actions shape the landscape, and beings whose significance within the tradition goes far beyond their appearance in a simplified, tourist-friendly narrative. What is more accessible is the oral tradition of the communities surrounding the Uluru Karajuda region, the Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara peoples whose country extends across a vast area of the Central Desert. These communities have their own accounts of large beings encountered in the landscape, beings that are distinct from the Chukopa ancestors, in that they are described in the register of historical encounter rather than foundational creation. Not the beings who made the land, but the beings who were present in it after it was made, who moved through it alongside human communities and were seen and known and remembered. The desert country of Central Australia is vast and, from a European perspective, intimidating in its emptiness and its heat. But it is not empty. It is full of life adapted to its conditions, full of the complex ecology of spinifex grassland and mulga scrub, and the extraordinary blooms that follow the rare rains. And it has been full of human life, continuously, for as far back as the archaeological record extends. The people who have lived in this country for 65,000 years know it with an intimacy that no outside researcher can replicate. They know what lives in it. They know what has lived in it, and their record of what has lived in it includes things that have no category in the Western scientific taxonomy. The accounts from the Central Desert tradition, gathered by anthropologists including W.E.H. Stanner, Donald Thompson, and Philip Clark in the 20th century, include persistent references to large beings of humanoid form that were encountered in specific areas of the desert, particularly in areas associated with significant water sources, which in the desert environment are also the areas of greatest ecological richness and greatest human traffic. These beings were not spirits in the sense that spirits typically appear in religious traditions. They were not invisible. They were not primarily supernatural. They were physical entities that could be seen, heard, and sometimes smelled, and whose encounters with human communities were remembered with the specificity of remembered events rather than the generality of mythological themes. Thompson, who lived for extended periods with Aboriginal communities in Arnhem Land in the 1930s and 1940s, and who conducted some of the most careful and respectful fieldwork of his era, recorded accounts that described large beings seen at the margins of permanent waterholes at dawn and dusk, the low-light conditions that would make precise identification difficult, but that would also reduce the possibility of confusing a tall human being for something else. His informants described these beings with the confidence of people reporting something they had personally witnessed or that had been witnessed by someone in their direct social network. The accounts were not mythological in tone, they were testimonial. The relationship between these Central Desert accounts and the specific 1947 reports is indirect but significant. The aerial survey activities that opened new parts of the interior in the post-war period were concentrated in exactly the regions where these traditions were strongest. The survey teams were looking for mineral resources, for potential dam sites, for the infrastructure possibilities of a country that was preparing for major development. They were not looking for what the Aboriginal tradition said the country contained, but the country offered what it offered regardless of what the searchers were looking for. Whether the survey teams or the follow-up parties that would have investigated any interesting finds had any understanding of the significance of what they may have found to the communities who already knew about it is not something the documentary record makes clear. The mid-20th century was not, in general, a period when the knowledge of Aboriginal communities was considered relevant to scientific investigation. The White Australia policy was still in effect. The widespread dispossession of Aboriginal peoples from their traditional lands was ongoing. The idea that an Aboriginal community's oral tradition might be a more reliable guide to the contents of a specific piece of country than the survey team's instruments would have been, in most cases, dismissed without examination. That dismissal is one of the most expensive intellectual mistakes in the history of Australian science. The cost of it is a century and a half of missed opportunities to understand this continent's full natural and human history. The recovery from that mistake is the work of the present moment, and it is being done, slowly, by researchers and community members who have enough respect for both knowledge systems to try to make them speak to each other. The island of Tasmania sits at the bottom of the Australian continent, separated from the mainland by the Bass Strait. It is green and cold and dramatically different in character from the continent to its north, more like a fragment of Scotland that washed away and ended up in the Southern Ocean than like anything usually described as Australian. Its forests are among the most ecologically significant in the world, dominated by ancient huon pines that grow for 3,000 years, and eucalyptus trees that reach heights of 100 meters. And within those forests, in the tradition of the Palawa people who have inhabited the island for at least 40,000 years, there are beings that do not appear in any settler naturalist's account of the island's fauna. The Palawa tradition, which survived the catastrophic genocide of the 18th and 19th centuries, only through the extraordinary resilience of the individuals and communities who kept it alive, includes accounts of tall beings associated with the deep forest. The accounts were documented most fully by George Augustus Robinson, the colonial protector of Aborigines, who travelled extensively through the island in the early 1830s, accompanying the surviving Aboriginal population during the period of forced removal to Flinders Island. Robinson's journals, now held in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, contain numerous accounts shared with him by his Aboriginal companions of beings in the Tasmanian forest that did not match the known fauna and that were described in terms of size and uprightness that suggested a large biped. Robinson was not a careful scientific observer. His primary interests were evangelical and administrative rather than natural historical. He recorded these accounts in passing without the systematic detail that would make them more useful to later researchers. But his position as the person in closest sustained contact with the surviving Palawa community at the time of their dispossession gives his records a significance that transcends their limitations. He was there, he was listening, and what he heard was consistent across multiple different individuals from different parts of the island in its description of large beings in the forest. Tasmania is an island. It has been an island, separated from the mainland for approximately 12,000 years, when sea level rise at the end of the last ice age flooded the land bridge that then connected it to Victoria. Before that flooding, for the entire period of Aboriginal occupation, Tasmania was the southernmost extension of a continuous landmass. The people who moved onto the island before the flooding were isolated from their mainland relatives after it, and the 40,000 years of separate development that followed produced a distinct cultural tradition, genetically connected to mainland Aboriginal peoples, but culturally distinct in specific ways that reflect the different environment and the absence of mainland cultural exchange. In a population that was isolated for 40,000 years, any biological characteristics that were established in the founding population would have been maintained and, in some cases, amplified by the isolation. If the population that arrived in Tasmania before the land bridge flooded included individuals with the genetic variants associated with unusual height, those variants would have persisted, in principle, in a way that might not have persisted in the larger, more genetically diverse mainland population. The suggestion is not that the Tasmanian Aboriginal population was uniformly tall, because the skeletal evidence from known Tasmanian Aboriginal remains does not support that interpretation. It is rather that if a distinct, height-associated genetic trait was present in the founding population, the Tasmanian isolation provides a mechanism by which that trait could have persisted as a distinct lineage within the population for a very long time. This is speculative. The ancient DNA work on Tasmanian Aboriginal remains is limited, both by the small sample size and by the ethical constraints that appropriately govern research involving community heritage. What can be said is that the oral tradition of a people who were isolated from outside influence for 40,000 years, and who maintained accounts of large forest-dwelling beings with the specificity of historical report rather than mythological convention, is a record that deserves more attention than it has received. The living Palawa community, which has survived genocide and dispossession, and the deliberate attempt to declare the original inhabitants of Tasmania extinct, maintains its cultural traditions with extraordinary determination. The tradition about the forest beings has not disappeared. It is part of the knowledge that has been preserved, passed down through the surviving lines of Palawa descent, carried through the worst that colonial history could do to it. It is still here. And the forests of Tasmania are still here, among the most ancient and most intact in the world, full of things that the scientific record has not yet fully accounted for. The continental shelf of Australia extends well beyond the current coastline, in many areas for hundreds of kilometres, before reaching the deep ocean floor. During the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels were over 100 metres lower than they are today. The additional land exposed by that lower sea level was, in some regions, comparable in area to modern-day Victoria or Tasmania. It was real land. It was inhabited. It had rivers, lakes, forests, and every other habitat that was present on the interior of the continent. And it was home to the people who lived there, who had lived there for 30,000 years before the sea began to rise and cover it. The flooding of this continental shelf is one of the largest and most significant environmental events in the history of human habitation on Earth. It happened over a period of approximately 10,000 years, from around 20,000 years ago to around 10,000 years ago, drowning a territory that, when combined across all of the world's continental shelves, was equivalent in total area to the present combined land area of Europe. Millions of people, living in coastal communities across the world's shorelines, watched their homes disappear under rising seas over the course of generations, moving inland, adapting, carrying their knowledge and their stories with them. The Aboriginal oral traditions that Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed examined, the ones that accurately describe specific coastlines now underwater, are the most thoroughly studied example of the preservation of this memory in oral form. But the preservation of the memory is not limited to coastlines. The beings that inhabited the now submerged landscape were part of the oral tradition of the people who lived there, and those beings were carried inland in the stories alongside everything else that needed to be preserved. The underwater Australian shelf is almost entirely unexplored. The technology required to conduct systematic archaeological survey of seafloor environments at these depths has only recently become available, and the funding and institutional will to apply it to this specific question is largely absent. A handful of researchers, including the archaeologist Jonathan Benjamin at Flinders University, have begun systematic survey work of specific shallow water sites off the Australian coast, and the early results are extraordinary. Stone tools, ground ochre, hearths preserved under sediment, the unmistakable signatures of human activity on what is now the seafloor. The people were there, their material culture was preserved, and in the sediment around those sites, along with the tools and the hearths, there are bones. Most of them belong to the animals that the people were hunting, but some of them, in the accounts of the divers and the underwater archaeologists who have begun to examine these sites, are not immediately identifiable as belonging to any currently catalogued species. This is not a claim that has been formally published or peer-reviewed. It is the kind of informal observation that precedes formal investigation, the kind of thing that researchers say to each other in the margins of conferences before the data has been gathered and the papers have been written. But it is consistent with a pattern that runs through everything that this account has been tracing. The suggestion, from multiple independent directions, that the full diversity of what lived in Australia during the deep past is not yet captured in the scientific record, and that the oral tradition of the people who were there, and whose traditions have been maintained continuously for the full duration of human occupation of this continent, is a more complete guide to that diversity than the existing archaeological and biological taxonomy. The sea covers a great deal of evidence. What the sea covers, the sea also preserves. The cold, low oxygen conditions of the sea floor are extraordinarily good for the preservation of organic material. Bones that would have been destroyed in centuries on a desert surface can survive for 10,000 years on a continental shelf. The archaeology of the submerged Australian shelf, if it is ever systematically conducted, may recover a record of the deep past that supplements and extends, and in some cases, radically revises what the terrestrial archaeology has established. And somewhere in that record, if the oral tradition is to be believed, there are the traces of beings whose size and character do not match the known human populations of the region. The Aboriginal peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the country that includes the submerged shelf, have rights and relationships that extend to that country underwater. The land did not stop being their country when the sea covered it. The dreaming stories that describe the pre-flooding landscape are still their stories. The beings described in those stories as inhabitants of the coastal and lowland environments are still part of their tradition. And when the archaeology of the submerged shelf finally produces results that surprise the scientific community, the Aboriginal communities whose tradition already knew what was there will not be surprised at all. They will, at most, be relieved that the evidence has finally caught up with the knowledge. There is a particular quality of attention that the oldest traditions require. Not the sharp, focused attention of problem solving or analysis, but something slower and more receptive. The kind of attention that you bring to a landscape when you are walking through it, with enough patience to let it show you things it would not show someone in a hurry. This is the attention that the Aboriginal tradition was built on, and it is the attention that encounters with the tall ones, in all their forms across all the traditions, seem to require. The people who have reported encountering these beings, whether in the deep bush of the Great Dividing Range, or in the desert country of the centre, or in the forests of Tasmania, or in the coastal valleys where farmers turned the soil and found the bones, are remarkably consistent in one element of their accounts that is rarely given much attention in the summaries and analyses. They are consistent about the quality of the encounter, the experience of being in the presence of something significantly larger than a human being, something that is clearly aware of you, something whose presence in the landscape is established and ancient in a way that your own presence is not, is described with a specific emotional register. It is not terror in the Hollywood sense. It is not the adrenaline shock of sudden danger. It is something older and slower, something that the body knows before the mind has had time to categorize it. A sense of scale, a sense of your own smallness. A sense that you have moved from the familiar foreground of experience into the background, into the deep context of a story that has been going on for a very long time without you. That quality of experience, described independently by people across centuries and cultural backgrounds, suggests something real. Not real in the narrow evidentiary sense. Real in the broader sense that human experience, when it is genuine, has a consistent texture that fabrication does not fully replicate. The people who describe this particular quality of encounter are not describing a frightening thing that they invented. They are describing something that frightened or awed them in a specific way, a way that the language of ordinary human experience barely accommodates, and they are reaching for the words to convey it without quite managing to do it justice. The Aboriginal tradition is not reaching. The Aboriginal tradition has the vocabulary for this experience, developed over 65,000 years of close and patient observation of everything that inhabits this continent. The beings of the tradition are not frightening in the way that ignorance frightens. They are not unknown. They are known deeply and carefully, known in the way that something is known when it has been a part of your world for as long as memory reaches. The relationship is complicated, sometimes dangerous, sometimes protective, governed by rules that have been learned through long experience. But it is not the relationship of the terrified unknown. It is the relationship of the deeply familiar. That familiarity, accumulated across 65,000 years of living in the same landscape as the tall ones, is the most important thing the tradition preserves. Not the proof of their existence, which the tradition has never required, because the tradition has never doubted. The familiarity. The knowledge of how to be in right relationship with beings that are larger and more powerful and older than you are, beings that have been part of the country since before your community arrived in it, beings whose relationship to the land gives them a standing that requires acknowledgement and respect. This knowledge is not transferable through the kind of summary that an account like this one can provide. It is transmitted through ceremony, through the years of gradual initiation, through the slow and careful learning that the tradition has always required. The summary can gesture toward it. It can say, this knowledge exists, it has been carefully maintained, it is the most complete guide available to the reality of what has lived in this landscape. But the summary cannot replace the knowledge itself. What the summary can do is create the conditions for a different kind of inquiry, an inquiry that begins with respect for what has already been known for longer than any other tradition has existed, an inquiry that treats the oral record with the same evidential seriousness as the material record, an inquiry that asks not just what the bones can tell us, but what the people who have always known about the bones can tell us about the bones. That inquiry is possible. The communities who hold the tradition are, in most cases, open to it, on terms that protect the sacred elements of their knowledge, while allowing the historically and scientifically significant elements to be examined. What is required is the institutional will, the funding, the genuine humility, and the patience to do the work in the right way. The bones found in 1947 are somewhere. The bones reported in the 19th century newspapers are somewhere. The beings described in 65,000 years of continuous oral tradition are, in the cosmological framework of the tradition, still in the country that has always held them. The question of whether the physical evidence can be brought back into view in a way that satisfies both the scientific requirement for material verification and the cultural requirement for respectful handling is a question for the present moment for the researchers and communities and institutions that are now, finally, beginning to have the right conversations. The night is nearly over. The light at the eastern edge of the sky, if you were somewhere that the sky is visible, would be changing now. The absolute dark giving way to the deep blue of pre-dawn. The blue that is older looking than the black and somehow more full of possibility. The birds in the Australian bush begin to call well before the light is strong enough to justify it. The butcher bird at 3 in the morning, the kookaburra at 4:30, the full chorus that builds, in the hour before sunrise, into something that is genuinely overwhelming in its complexity and its exuberance. The accumulated expression of every creature that has been in these landscapes long enough to know when the night is ending and when it is time to announce the return of the day. The tradition that holds the memory of the tall ones is like that chorus. It is the accumulated expression of 65,000 years of attentive presence in a landscape that has rewarded attentiveness with survival. It is complex beyond the capacity of any single account to capture it. It is continuous in a way that no external disruption, however violent, has been able to entirely break, and it is, in its own way, announcing something, the return of something that was never really gone, the arrival in the wider awareness of a knowledge that has always been here. Listen, in whatever stillness the night has left you, the story is still sounding, the country is still holding what it holds, and the oldest voices, the ones that have been speaking since before any written language existed on this planet, are still speaking, in ceremony and in story, and in the careful, patient, irrefutable presence of everything that the land has not forgotten. The Aboriginal elder David Unaipon, sometimes called Australia's Leonardo da Vinci, for the breadth of his intellectual gifts, wrote in the early 20th century about the relationship between Aboriginal oral tradition and the landscape in terms that anticipated, by several decades, the scientific research that would eventually confirm the accuracy of that tradition. Unaipon, a Ngarrindjeri man from the Lower Murray region of South Australia, was the first Aboriginal person to publish a literary work in Australia, and his writings on traditional knowledge, while shaped by the constraints of his era and by his own Christian faith, expressed a consistent understanding that the stories of his people were not primitive inventions, but sophisticated records of genuine events. In his notebooks, some of which remain unpublished in the archives of the South Australian Museum, Unaipon described what he called the memory of country, the accumulated record that the landscape held of everything that had happened on it. He was not making a metaphysical claim in the purely spiritual sense. He was describing, in the language available to him, something close to what environmental archaeologists now call landscape memory, the idea that the physical features of a landscape encode its history in ways that can be read by people with sufficient knowledge of its patterns and processes. Unaipon believed that the accounts of large beings in the tradition of his own people and of other Aboriginal peoples across the continent were part of the landscape memory in this sense. They were not invented. They were observed and recorded and transmitted as carefully as everything else in the tradition, because the tradition had always understood that accurate knowledge of the landscape was the foundation of survival. You could not afford to be wrong about what lived in your country. The consequences were too immediate and too serious. The tradition was, in this light, the world's oldest and most rigorously tested ecological database, and the database said the tall ones were real. Unaipon did not live to see the research that would validate his understanding of the tradition's accuracy. He died in 1967, 2 years before the Mungo lady was found, decades before the linguistic research that confirmed Aboriginal oral accounts of sea level change. But his understanding was sound. The tradition was a record. The record was accurate. And the accuracy extended to the things that were hardest for the dominant culture to accept, to the records of beings whose existence fell outside the categories that European natural history had established for the inhabitants of the Australian continent. His face is on the Australian $50 note. It is a form of recognition that he would have received with the quiet irony that characterized his public manner. Grateful for the acknowledgement, aware of its limitations, understanding that the real recognition was not a place on a banknote, but a genuine engagement with what he had spent his life trying to share, The tradition, the knowledge, the 65,000-year record of everything that this country holds. That engagement is happening now, piece by piece, researcher by researcher, conversation by conversation. It is not complete. It may not be complete within the lifetimes of the people currently pursuing it, but it is happening. And somewhere in the country, patient as stone, the tall ones wait for the conversation to reach them. Rest now. The night has done its work. The stories have been told. Whatever the morning brings, the knowledge is still here, as it has always been here, in the land, and in the people who have never stopped carrying it. There is a kind of knowledge that does not survive translation, not because it is secret necessarily, or protected in the way that sacred knowledge is protected, but because its meaning is constitutively embedded in the context of its making, in the landscape, in the season, in the relationship between the speaker and the listener, in the accumulated experience of a particular life lived in a particular place. When you pull it out of that context and lay it flat in the pages of an academic article or the hours of a documentary, you get something that looks like the knowledge but is not the knowledge, something that points toward the original without being able to carry its full meaning. The tradition about the tall ones is, in its most complete form, exactly this kind of knowledge. The summaries that reach the outside world are real. They are accurate as far as they go. But they are like a photograph of a living forest, capturing the visual information accurately while being unable to convey the smell, the temperature, the sound of the wind moving through the canopy, the particular quality of the light at a specific time of day. The photograph is not false. It is incomplete in a way that only experience of the original can remedy. This matters because it sets a limit on what research conducted at a distance can establish. You can collect newspaper reports, examine rock art photography, read the accounts of colonial anthropologists, listen to the recordings of researchers who worked with elders in the 20th century, and arrive at a picture that is intellectually compelling and historically significant. But the limit of that research is the photograph of the forest. The full knowledge, the living knowledge, requires a different kind of access. The people who have that access are the people who have always had it. The communities whose relationship with the tradition is not academic but constitutive, who do not study the knowledge but are shaped by it, who carry it not in their notes but in their bodies and their ceremonies and their deep understanding of the specific country where they were born and where they will, in most cases, be buried. These are the people whose engagement is required if the investigation of the tall ones is ever to move beyond the photograph and into the forest itself. The conditions for that engagement are better now than they have been at any point since the beginning of European settlement. The legal recognition of Aboriginal land rights, however incomplete and contested, has returned some measure of autonomy to communities that were dispossessed for over a century. The cultural safety protocols that now govern research involving Aboriginal communities, however imperfectly implemented, represent a genuine shift from the extractive model of the colonial period. The growing number of Aboriginal scholars with advanced academic qualifications who are able to move between the knowledge systems and to advocate within institutions for a genuinely equitable approach to research represents a generational shift in the capacity of the communities to shape how their knowledge is engaged with. And the interest from outside those communities in taking the tradition seriously as a form of historical documentation is at an all-time high. The research on oral accounts of sea level change, the confirmation of megafaunal descriptions in the archaeological record, the growing body of work on indigenous ecological knowledge, and its accuracy in describing the conditions of specific environments. All of this creates an intellectual climate in which the claim that Aboriginal oral tradition accurately describes the presence of large humanoid beings in the Australian landscape is no longer instantly dismissible, not by researchers who have followed the evidence of the tradition's accuracy in other domains. The investigation is not finished. It is, in a real sense, still in its early stages. The bones of 1947 have not been found and examined and reported in a peer-reviewed journal. The footprint casts in Rex Gilroy's collection have not been subjected to the kind of rigorous forensic analysis that would allow a definitive assessment of their origin. The elongated figures in the Kimberley rock art have not been subjected to the complete systematic analysis that their importance would justify. The oral tradition of dozens of language groups, most of it still held internally, has not been engaged with in the collaborative, respectful, serious way that would allow its full evidence to be assessed. But the direction of movement is clear. More evidence is accessible than ever before. more researchers are asking the right questions, more community members are willing to engage with those questions, and the tradition itself, the 65,000-year record that has always been the primary source for this story, is still intact, still being maintained, still carrying forward the knowledge of beings whose physical existence in this landscape left traces in the earth and in the cultural memory of the people who saw them and knew them, and made sure that the knowledge of them survived. When the full investigation finally produces the results that the tradition suggests it should produce, when the bones are found and dated and described in their full physical significance, when the rock art is finally read in the way its creators intended it to be read, rather than in the way outside researchers have imposed on it, when the oral tradition is engaged with in its own terms and allowed to say what it has always been saying about the nature of this landscape and its inhabitants, the picture that emerges will require a substantial revision of the official account of Australian natural and human history. That revision is not something to fear, it is something to welcome. The history of science is the history of revisions, of the expansion of the known through the honest confrontation with the unknown, of the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to places that the existing framework did not anticipate. The Aboriginal tradition has been pointing towards specific places in the landscape and specific events in the past for longer than any other tradition has existed. The evidence it points toward is real, and the revision it will require, when the investigation is done, will make the story of this continent, and by extension the story of human life on this planet, richer and stranger and more wonderful than the current official account has managed to convey. Consider for a moment the act of transmission itself. A grandmother sitting with her grandchildren at the edge of the firelight in the desert night, with the stars overhead in their extraordinary southern density. She is telling them something that she was told by her own grandmother, who was told by hers, in an unbroken chain of transmission that extends back through time to a point so distant that the landscape they sit in looked different. The sea was further away, the climate was cooler, and the beings she is describing about were still alive and visible in the country, still seen at the margins of the waterhole, still heard in the movement of very large things through the scrub at night. The grandmother does not know that her grandmother's grandmother's grandmother was telling the same story in a world that the ice ages had shaped differently. She does not need to know this. The story she was given is the story she gives, and the story she gives carries, embedded in its specific images and its specific landscape references, and its specific warnings and its specific relationships between specific beings, information that has been tested against reality continuously for 65,000 years, and found, again and again, to be accurate. This is what the tradition is, not a body of literature fixed in a text, not a collection of stories that might or might not have happened, a living, continuously tested, continuously validated record of the landscape and everything that has inhabited it, transmitted by a technology, the human voice, the ceremony, the relationship, that has proven far more durable than any written archive, far more accurate than any reconstruction from fragmentary physical evidence alone. The bones found in 1947 are a small piece of this story. They are the physical trace of beings whose existence the tradition had recorded long before any European arrived in Australia with survey equipment and the intention of documenting the interior. They are important because physical evidence matters, because the dominant culture requires physical evidence before it will listen, because the photograph of the forest is sometimes the only thing that will convince people who have never been in the forest to believe that it exists. But the bones are not the core of the story. The core of the story is the grandmother at the fire, telling her grandchildren what her grandmother told her, in a tradition so deep and so continuous and so carefully maintained that it has preserved accurate information across an expanse of time that makes the entire span of recorded human history look like a recent addition. The core of the story is the living knowledge. The bones are the confirmation. And the night that holds all of this, the Australian night with its cold southern stars and its extraordinary ancient silence, the night that has been the setting for this particular act of transmission for 65,000 years, without interruption, is still here, still turning, still full of everything that has ever been present in it. One more thing, one more element that the record contains and that deserves acknowledgement before the night is fully over. The tradition of the Tall Ones is not, across the breadth of the Aboriginal cultures that hold it, a tradition of fear. It is sometimes a tradition of danger, because the beings described are powerful, and the power can be destructive if proper relationships are not maintained. But danger and fear are different things. Danger is a real condition of the world, something to be acknowledged and responded to appropriately. Fear is a response to what is unknown and unmanageable. The Aboriginal tradition does not fear the tall ones in the sense of finding them incomprehensible and threatening. The tradition understands them in the specific way that 65,000 years of coexistence produces understanding. They were here before. They are part of the country. Their presence in the landscape is part of what makes the landscape what it is. And the human communities that have shared this landscape with them for longer than any other human communities have shared any landscape with anything, have developed a relationship with them that is embedded in ceremony and law and the knowledge of how to be in right relationship with all of the country's inhabitants. This is, in its own way, the most extraordinary thing about the tradition, not the size of the beings, not the physical evidence that occasionally confirms their historical reality, not the mystery of the 1947 finds or the pattern of institutional inaccessibility that surrounds the skeletal record. The most extraordinary thing is the relationship, the 65,000-year record of human communities that knew what shared their landscape and that developed through long experience and careful knowledge building, the practices and the understanding that allowed coexistence to be maintained. That knowledge of coexistence, of relationship, of right behavior toward beings larger and more powerful than yourself is exactly the kind of knowledge that the modern world tends to generate in its own awkward way, stumbling toward it through conflict and crisis rather than inheriting it from a tradition that has already done the work. The tradition of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia is, among the many things it is, a record of how human beings can live in genuine relationship with all of the life of a landscape, including the life that exceeds the ordinary human scale. That record is available. It has always been available. It has been maintained through everything that colonial history has done to make its maintenance difficult. And it is waiting, with the patience that all truly ancient things possess, for the broader human community to become ready to receive it in the full depth and seriousness that it deserves. When that moment comes, the story of the tall ones will be one of the things that changes how the world understands itself. Not because giants are more important than the other things the tradition knows, but because the acknowledgement of the tradition's accuracy about the tall ones will require the acknowledgement that the tradition was right about everything else too, that it has always been the primary record of this continent's natural and human history, and that the 65,000 years it represents are not a prehistory to be briefly acknowledged before the real history begins, but the real history itself, the longest and most careful account of human experience in relationship with a specific place that our species has ever produced. That is what the bones of 1947 point toward, ultimately. Not just the physical confirmation of beings whose size exceeded ordinary human dimensions. The confirmation of a tradition, the validation of a knowledge system, the invitation, extended by the land itself through the evidence it has preserved, to finally take seriously what has always been there and has always been true. The night is over, the story is told. The country holds everything it has always held, and the oldest voices are still speaking, in the language of the land, in the language of ceremony, in the patient, irrefutable language of 65,000 years of unbroken human presence in the oldest landscape on Earth. Sleep in that presence. Let it hold you. And if the morning brings you a question that the night has planted, tend it carefully. It may be one of the most important questions you have ever thought to ask. There is a researcher who spent the better part of a decade filing freedom of information requests with Australian state museums and university collections, attempting to locate the provenance and current whereabouts of skeletal remains described in the 19th century newspaper archive. The researcher, who has chosen to remain unnamed in published accounts of this work, documented a specific and consistent pattern in the institutional responses. Materials described in the historical record as having been sent to specific collections could, in a significant proportion of cases, be confirmed to have arrived through accession records that reference the original find. The accession records existed, the catalogue entries existed, but the physical specimens, when requested for examination, were described as being currently unavailable, under review, not accessible to general researchers, or impossible to locate within the current storage arrangements. This pattern, across multiple institutions in multiple Australian states, is not what you would expect from random archival chaos. Random archival chaos produces a different pattern. One in which the inaccessibility is distributed across all categories of material, in which ordinary faunal specimens and routine archaeological finds are as likely to be missing as anomalous ones. What the researcher found was a selective pattern, one in which the specific category of large, anomalous human-formed skeletal material was substantially more likely to be inaccessible than other comparable categories of material from the same period and the same institutional collections. The implications of this selective inaccessibility are not a matter for the imagination alone. They are a matter for the institutional governance structures of the museums and universities involved. If a pattern of selective inaccessibility affecting a specific category of material can be demonstrated through systematic review of accession records and requests for access, that pattern is itself an archival fact that requires explanation. The explanation may be mundane. It may be that large, unusual skeletal remains attracted more attention and were more likely to be borrowed, loaned, or transferred between collections in ways that produce more opportunities for loss. It may be that the storage conditions appropriate for large specimens were less available than those for smaller ones, producing a higher rate of deterioration. These are hypotheses that can be tested. What cannot be dismissed is the pattern itself. It is documented, it is consistent, and it is consistent specifically with the oral tradition of the communities whose knowledge of the landscape predates the institutional collections by 65,000 years, and who have always maintained that the physical evidence of the tall ones exists, is periodically found, and is periodically removed from general accessibility. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which holds one of the most significant collections of historical documentation about Aboriginal culture and history in the world, has been engaged in its own repatriation processes for several decades. The scope of these processes, which involve not just skeletal remains, but also sacred objects, ceremonial items, and historical records of various kinds, has required a systematic examination of what the collection holds that was not previously available to researchers. Members of the institution's staff have described, in informal accounts, encountering materials in that examination process that were not what the catalogue described them as. Materials that had been mislabeled, stored in the wrong location, or entered into the collection under a description that obscured their actual character. Whether any of those mislabeled or misdescribed materials relate to the specific question of unusual skeletal remains is not something that has been publicly documented, but the existence of a systematic review process conducted by an institution with the mandate and the resources to do it properly, in the period when the questions about the full content of Australian collections are most pressing, creates the possibility that materials of the kind that the tradition describes will eventually be identified and reported. When that reporting happens, the context in which it will be understood is the context that this account has been tracing, the oral tradition that always knew, the rock art that always showed, the newspaper archive that recorded the finds, the pattern of inaccessibility that followed, and the persistent, patient, undefeated knowledge of the communities who are the legitimate custodians of everything this story contains. The bones will speak. The tradition has always said so. The country holds everything, and eventually, when the time is right, the country gives it back. Not on any schedule that human impatience can predict. On its own schedule, which is the schedule of something that has been here for 500 million years and expects to be here for 500 million more, and for which the activities of a species that has been on the continent for 65,000 years, and of the subpopulation of that species that arrived 230 years ago, constitute a recent development not yet long enough to have established a permanent character. The country is patient, the tradition is patient, the bones are patient, and the question of what exactly was found in 1947, and where it went, and what it means for the story of this continent, and the people who have always known that story, is a question that has not been answered yet, but that the land has already decided it will answer, in its own time, in the way that it chooses. That is enough, perhaps, for one night. More than enough for the sleepless hours that this kind of question tends to produce in minds that are genuinely curious and genuinely awake. The question will still be there in the morning. The country will still be there in the morning. And the tradition that holds the fullest answer to the question will still be there in the morning, as it has been there every morning for 65,000 years, waiting for the world to become quiet enough to hear what it has always been saying. This is what the oldest story in the world asks of you. Not belief, not action, just the willingness to listen with the kind of attention that respects what it encounters, the kind of attention that understands that you are not the first person to have sat with this question in the dark, that you are part of a long conversation that started before any writing existed and will continue long after this voice falls silent. Be part of that conversation. That is enough. That is in fact everything. The stars above Australia are turning through their slow ancient rotation, the Milky Way a river of light across the darkness. The Southern Cross steady in its place, the Magellanic clouds at the edge of vision, the dark constellations of the Aboriginal sky mapped in the spaces between the stars. The land is dark and warm and full of everything it has always held, The tradition is intact, the knowledge is whole. And somewhere in the country, patient and present and unhurried, the tall ones are in the rock, in the earth, in the deep structure of a landscape that has been their home longer than the word home has existed in any human language. Rest now. You have come a long way through this night. Let the country hold you as it has always held everything that comes to it, fully and without judgment, in the deep and patient embrace of the oldest land on earth. The story continues. It always has. It always will. And now, for you, it is time to sleep. There is a geological concept called deep time that John McPhee popularized in a series of essays about American landscape, but that applies with even greater force to Australia than to almost anywhere else on Earth. Deep time is the understanding that the history of the planet is not 5,000 years long or 10,000 years long or even the million years that first-generation Darwinian geology proposed. It is 4.5 billion years long. And the compression of that understanding into ordinary human consciousness, the attempt to hold a span of time that dwarfs human experience by a factor so large that the mathematics becomes essentially abstract, produces a specific kind of vertigo. A loosening of the grip that the immediate and the recent have on the attention. A shift in scale that is simultaneously humbling and, in its own strange way, relieving. Australia is a continent that forces deep time awareness on anyone who pays attention to it. The rocks in the Pilbara region of Western Australia are among the oldest exposed rock on the planet's surface, some of them dating to 3.5 billion years. The Archean and Proterozoic geology of the center and west of the continent is a record of the planet's early history that exists almost nowhere else in this state of accessibility and preservation. Standing on the right formation in the right part of the Western Australian outback, you are standing on rock that formed when the continents were arranged differently, when the atmosphere had a different composition, when the forms of life on Earth were so different from everything now alive that they could not share a name with any current organism. This deep time context is not separate from the story of the tall ones. It is the geological frame within which everything else has happened. The Aboriginal peoples who have lived on this deep time landscape for 65,000 years have, through the tradition, developed an understanding of time that is different from the Western linear model, and that in some respects anticipates the scientific concept of deep time more fully than European thought managed before geology achieved it in the 19th century. The dreaming is not mythology about the past. It is a framework for understanding that the deep past is present, that the processes that shape the world are ongoing, that the beings and events of the foundational time are accessible in the landscape now to those who know how to read it. The bones that the landscape holds, the bones of ordinary humans, and the bones of extraordinary ones, and the bones of every creature that has lived and died on this continent across the span of its human occupation, are part of the geological record in this deep sense. They are compressed into the sediment layers. They are preserved in the cave deposits. They are eroding from the riverbanks that the seasonal flooding cuts a little deeper each year. The landscape is always releasing what it holds, slowly and selectively, in the pace of its own processes rather than in the pace of human curiosity. The 1947 finds, whatever they were and wherever they are now, are part of this ongoing release. They were not the first. They will not be the last. The pattern of anomalous skeletal finds in Australia is not historical. It is current. People are still finding unusual things in the Australian earth. The resources of the internet, which now allow accounts of such finds to be shared instantly and widely, mean that the documentary record of current finds is richer than it has ever been, even if the institutional response to them remains as cautious and as ambiguous as it has always been. The tradition, meanwhile, continues its long, patient work of transmission. The grandmothers at the fire, the elder who knows which country holds which knowledge, the young person being initiated into the deeper layers of what their community holds, the researcher whose training in both the Western and the Aboriginal knowledge systems allows them to move between the frameworks without losing the integrity of either. All of these are part of the ongoing process by which the oldest story in the world keeps itself alive and keeps itself available. The tall ones are in that story. They have always been in that story. And the story is still being told tonight and every night in the oldest continuous living tradition that human beings have ever produced, on the oldest landscape that human feet have walked for longer than anywhere else on the surface of the earth. That is the final thing to carry into the quiet of the night. Not a mystery unsolved, though it is that. Not a conspiracy implied, though the pattern of inaccessibility is real and deserves investigation. Not a sensation to be startled by, though the scale of what the tradition describes can still startle even the most composed listener. Just this, there is a story. It has been told without interruption for 65,000 years. It is still being told tonight. And it says that this landscape, this impossibly old, impossibly vast, impossibly rich Australian landscape, has always been home to more than we have been told to expect. Believe it or not, investigate it or not, but do not dismiss it without examining it. The tradition has earned, by its demonstrated accuracy, across domains that the dominant culture once refused to take seriously. The right to be taken seriously in the domains it describes that the dominant culture still finds difficult. The tall ones are one of those domains. The bones are part of that right. The night is long enough to hold all of this and still have room for sleep. So, sleep. The country is watching, the tradition is intact, and somewhere in the deep interior, the bones are in the earth, and the earth is keeping them in the patient, unhurried way it keeps everything, until the right moment, the right hands, the right question, and the right respect arrive together in the same place. That moment is coming. This night is part of it. This listening is part of it. Thank you for being part of it. Good night. There is one last image to leave you with before the silence takes over completely, and the night does what nights do. Somewhere in the Australian interior, there is a sandstone overhang that no tourist has ever visited, and that no researcher has ever photographed, and that exists in the knowledge of one community, or perhaps two, as a site that holds paintings of unusual age and unusual character. The paintings show figures. The figures are tall. Their proportions are those of beings whose heads are closer to the ceiling of the overhang than the heads of any ordinary human being would reach. They are painted in ochre that has been renewed many times over a period of time that is difficult to estimate, and that the community would put, in their own accounting, at a number that would surprise everyone who heard it. The figures have no mouths. Their eyes are large and steady, looking at something that the painter knew was worth looking at, something that required that quality of attention, that specific orientation of a gaze that can see what ordinary eyes miss. Around them, on the same rock surface, are handprints. Ordinary human handprints in red ochre placed there by people who were saying, in the wordless language that transcends any spoken tongue, "We were here. We saw this. We held our hands up to the stone and pressed, and the record of our presence remained." The tall figures and the human handprints are on the same surface. They were placed there by the same tradition, by the same understanding, by the same knowing that what matters must be marked, and what is marked must be maintained. And what is maintained becomes part of the record that the country holds for as long as the country holds anything, which is to say, for longer than any human lifetime can conceive. The figures are still there. The handprints are still there. The overhang is still standing, and the community that knows about it is still here, still carrying the knowledge, still maintaining the relationship, still saying, in their ongoing ceremonies and their ongoing stories and their ongoing presence in the country, what their ancestors have always said about the beings those figures represent. They were real, they were here, and the land remembers. That is the whole of it. That is the oldest story in the world, reduced to its essential form, real, here, remembered, and told again tonight.